Back in the 1990s, Rareware was on a roll. After a slew of hits they released on the Nintendo Entertainment System, the company's purchase of SGI Challenge workstations, which allowed them to create advanced 3D visuals for the era, sparked a chain of events that landed them a spot as a second-party developer for Nintendo. And it was all thanks to a bunch of markets. Donkey Kong had been dormant for a little while after a few poorly received games, but under the team at Rare, the series experienced new life and proved itself as a platforming juggernaut in its own right with its SNES reboot, Donkey Kong Country. With the advanced visuals provided by those workstations, these games rocked the world, and according to many, were one of the main reasons Nintendo managed to win the vicious 4th generation console war in the end. These days, the series is unfortunately not talked about quite as much as it once was, at least in my experience, but there's that group of fans, both old and new, however big or small, that still care. And judging by what I've been up to around here lately, it's safe to say that I am one of them. I didn't play these games when I was a kid. I was born well after they had pretty much left the general public consciousness, so I had no idea what a Super Nintendo even was for the longest time. Come high school though, when I had gotten myself a couple retro consoles, these games were among those I picked up for my SNES, and I really enjoyed them. To this day, I still think DKC 1 was a fantastic start for the series, albeit not without the occasional things I felt could have been improved. And that's where DKC 2 comes in, which in my humble opinion is one of the greatest gaming sequels of all time. After the 2-hour video I did on this 2D platformer, what else would I say about it? Everything about DKC 2, including its storytelling and how it ties into the gameplay and progression, art direction, soundtrack, level design, character and personality, bonus content, and so on felt just right. Like it had an immense amount of thought put into it. I'd say it's when DKC really came into its own as a series. And it was a testament to the creativity and passion that's possible when developers really put their minds into what they're doing. However, for as picturesque a note as that would have been for DK's reboot to go out, a game series almost never stops after just 2 outings, especially in a franchise capable of having a theoretically infinite amount of entries. You could cite any number of reasons, including some diatribe about capitalism or whatever, and yeah, making profits is undeniably a huge motivator. But I'd like to think that it has something to do with our natural tendency for completionism. The rule of 3, if you will. It just makes our, no pun intended, monkey brains feel good. Of course, given the fact that we're still here, DKC was another one of those series that would receive a 3rd game in its console of origin to cap things off. As I said, in many ways, it makes sense that Rare would want to do this. A 3rd game would be perfect for people who wanted more of this series, especially after the 2 excellent titles that it had produced already, since Rare were basically already pros at this. In this case, though, things would be different, and it was all due to another lovely case of circumstance. When DKC 3 started development shortly after the 2nd game had been released, it was already 1995. Most people weren't looking forward to games on the 16-bit systems anymore, since by this point the next generation was on the horizon. In fact, it had already started with the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation that year. Naturally, Nintendo had been conducting research and development of its own for some time, specifically into using silicon graphics technology similar to that which was used by Rare for these games, as well as some others like Killer Instinct or the soon-to-evolve Project Dream. God, that's such an unfortunate name in hindsight. Makes me want to throw up just thinking about it. Anyway, this console, initially referred to as Project Reality and later the Ultra 64, was prepared to release in 1996 as the Nintendo 64 after a delay had pushed it back an extra several months. With that in mind, most people were probably saving up their money for an N64, if they hadn't jumped ship to the PlayStation that holiday season, which was already beginning to sell like hotcakes. Rare could sense the tides of the video game industry turning, and so many of their best senior staff changed their focus to N64 development. This left DKC 3 with, what I presume anyway, to be Rare's B team, who likely didn't have as much experience as the team members who had been actively working on the series from its inception. I don't mean that as an insult to anyone involved with the game, of course, but when a series changes hands in such a way, it's at least worth noting due to the potential changes such a transition can bring about. And I'm sure it was stressful for at least some involved. Despite this situation though, the development team for DKC 3 had big ambitions in mind for the game, and they went ahead with implementing several changes to the series that, from the way I see it anyway, seem to exemplify such an intent. With that said, they still wanted to keep the same appeal as the previous games, and meant for it to maintain everything they had done so well. It would be an immense challenge, especially after the high bar set by DKC 2 and the stressed conditions behind the scenes, but they still pressed on regardless. Similar to the previous game, the threequel features a subtitle referencing one of the series' characters, but this time, as far as I can tell, there weren't nearly as many variations. Whether or not that's the case, the game got the title Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble, which is rather fitting if you ask me, as you'll see soon. DKC 3 was eventually released in November 1996, but sadly not on the 21st. You were this close. Upon coming out, DKC 3 experienced some success, but as Rare may have feared, its sales were not as spectacular as its predecessors. Whereas those games shipped at least 5 million each, breaking sales records and becoming some of the best-selling SNES games of all time, Donkey Kong Country 3 was a lot more modest. It topped out at 3 million copies sold, and just missed the console's top 10. It's still quite good for the time, but when placed next to this, and this, yeah, it's quite a stark difference. Some have suggested that, allegedly, the Nintendo 64 and its then recent release were a huge factor as to what caused this, but no, I don't even think that's a possibility. I think that's definitely what happened. People were a lot more compelled by the 5th generation and its true polygonal 3D visuals, so DKC3 and its console were pretty much left behind. A game's sales aren't the only metric to gauge how well it was received, however, and even though it wasn't a breakout success, DKC3 got generally positive reviews at the time. While reviewers did tend to criticize its similarity to the previous games, as in they felt it didn't do too much new from a moment-to-moment gameplay front, praise was given to its visuals, music, and replay value, and the game mostly got scores in the 8 to 9 out of 10 range. Its batting average in this regard was a little lower than the previous games, but still pretty high overall. From what I can tell, those who stuck around in the SNES tended to enjoy DKC3, but there seemed to be a general sentiment of franchise fatigue going around. As a result, this game appears to have been forgotten about, at least in comparison to its predecessors. Not as many people played it as the first two, so naturally, plenty had either never heard of it or just never got a chance to experience the game because they had moved on to the next generation instead. Nowadays, pretty much the only people who talk about the third game are core fans of DKC, and in my experience, their thoughts are incredibly split. This tends to happen a lot with these old games, with us being in the era of people giving hot takes on classics after all, and I'd say DKC3 is notable in this regard. Some people adore the game and consider it an underrated gem, possibly even the best in the trilogy, whereas an essentially equal amount think it's the worst in the trilogy, and a huge disappointment after the high bar set by the original two. In addition, there's those who are more on the fence about it, ranking it squarely in the middle. It's not as outwardly polarizing as some other games from what I've seen, because even most people who consider it the worst in the series will admit they still think it's a solid game, but out of the 3 DKC games, it's the one with the most scattered takes for sure. As for my own experience, well, in this game's case, it was kinda weird. In my DKC1 video, I told the story about getting my SNES when I was bedridden from a severe leg fracture back in 2017, and that whole experience was the foundation for my appreciation for the series. I had some trouble due to the shitty setup I had to deal with, but ultimately really loved the game. I obviously planned on playing its 2 sequels as a result, and was especially looking forward to DKC2, for obvious reasons. However, that wouldn't be the next game in the series I would get. Having given both sequels as strong gift suggestions that Christmas, I ended up receiving DKC3 as a present from my brother. I'm pretty sure, I don't remember all the details exactly. Regardless, I got my hands on the third game before the second one, and so I ended up playing the series out of order. Oh, the humanity. I would later get DKC2 sometime after the new year, and in the time between these two events, I played DKC3 on and off. I remember enjoying it well enough, albeit not without hazy memories of getting frustrated at certain parts. I distinctly remember making it all the way to the last world, but then one of the levels stopped me in my tracks and prevented me from finishing it for months. Well after my leg had healed and I had moved back to the old CRT that I nowadays rarely use anymore. Weirdly enough, I had a similar experience with getting stuck in Gloomy Gulch from DKC2. Web Woods was just busting my balls, I suppose. In any case, I can't remember which game I finished first, but I ended up beating both eventually. Later, I would go on to achieve full completion in DKC2 for the first time, but in DKC3, well, I had tried to do it, but by that point my interest in other games overtook my desire to see it through to the end. As the years have gone by, I found myself coming back to DKC3 far less than the other 2 games, and in fact the amount of playthroughs I've done can be counted on one hand. I've just never enjoyed this game quite as much as its predecessors, and was always squarely in the camp of this being the weakest game in the trilogy, for a multitude of reasons. That said, it has been quite a while since I've come back to this game, and if you give something some time and distance, it may give you a new perspective on said thing and allow you to see it in a new light. Sometimes this can be for the worse, leaving you thinking less of something you've always loved, but other times it can be for the better, giving you a newfound appreciation of that thing. Both cases have happened to me in the past, so who knows, maybe DKC3 will be one of the latter. Having already talked at length about this series recently, I'm more than willing to give it another playthrough and see how things go. Hell, while I'm at it, I might as well give full completion as well, to fit in with the other 2 videos if nothing else. Will my thoughts on this game remain as relatively mixed as they've always been, or will I come out on the other end with a newly discovered undying love for it? Whatever happens, these are my thoughts on Donkey Kong Country 3. Enjoy. When you start this game up, everything's the same, but nothing's the same. Whereas the previous 2 games began with pretty much the exact same sequence, with Rareware's logo being drawn on screen, then shrinking and showing a Nintendo logo before the game's release year and the title screen, DKC3 shakes things up and has some fun with it. We get a shot of Dixie and another unknown Kong, who I'll get to in a moment, using Rare's logo to bounce around, and then spinning a mechanical xylophone in sync with the background music. I love this kind of stuff, you know, where the game's characters screw with a logo of some sort, and Rare is one of the companies known for having fun with this. From what I can tell, DKC3 was actually the start of this trend in their games, and it's a fun way for the game to make a first impression. I also appreciate the fact that the sprite animations have returned, even if this still isn't quite as elaborate as the DKC1 intro, and the title screen that appears even has an animated logo with the text "Dixie Kong's Double Trouble plummeting blending in from the top of the screen. It looks rather nice, although those black bars on the top and sides of the screen really make my OCD alarms go off. That's one of the main reasons I have these borders around all my non-widescreen footage. It just looks wrong otherwise, if you ask me. In any event, the save screen this time around is noticeably different as well. It even features, get this, a name entry. Holy shit, boys, we're in the future. In all seriousness, I quite like the look of this screen. It's a huge VCR with a neat 1970s hardwood design, with save files represented by VHS tapes and options that take the form of utility buttons. I find that really creative and fun. Anyway, upon actually getting into the game, you may notice that things appear rather different from the offset. Whereas the last two titles started you out on an overworld map of sorts that brought you to a straightforward Super Mario World-esque map screen, in which you could only navigate between fixed level icons, and where in the first level you could enter featured a quasi-cutscene giving you a basic rundown on the plot, this game plops you into a relatively open overworld screen where you're able to freely swim around, and features no exposition to speak of. Instead of spawning in on the icon for the opening world, Dixie, who you're controlling, has to swim to this island here, where she meets up with Wrinkly Kong, a brown bear who's part of a new ensemble of characters introduced for this game called the Brothers Bear, more on them later, and Funky Kong. Strangely, not one of them explains where we are, why Dixie has come here, or what's going on. Now, we're quite literally just dumped into this mysterious new region with no elaboration. Wrinkly says she's retired from teaching Kremlings and now sits around exercising or watching TV in her safe cave. You can guess what that's for based on the name. Bazaar the bear talks about the items on his shop, and Funky mentions how he set up a new boat shop called Funky's Rentals on the island. He also introduces Dixie's infant cousin Kitty Kong, who will be joining us on our adventure. Again, like with the Brothers Bear, I'll get to him, but yeah, that's all you get in this game. This is one of those cases where the plot's all in the manual, which could be a potential problem, as most people likely won't own that. I know I don't anyway, since I got this game in the same way as most others do, a loose cartridge with nothing else. Thankfully it's preserved online, but still, it's a shame because I honestly think this just might be the series' most compelling story, all things considered, at least in terms of the pure plot beats themselves. As the manual states, DKC3 is set several months after the previous game. Following the defeat of Captain K. Rool, DK's rescue, and the complete collapse of Crocodile Isle, the Kongs were still celebrating, and had settled down on DK Island once again. Donkey and Diddy often spent time relaxing on the island's beaches, drinking banana milkshakes, and just generally enjoying peace in their lives yet again. Dixie often joined them, especially when she had nothing else to do and wanted to have some fun herself. Things were going smoothly, and the Kongs could finally rest again without worrying about those crocodile bastards getting in the way. However, things were different one morning, because when Dixie woke up and checked Diddy's room, he was nowhere to be seen. All that was there was a note saying that Diddy had left early to explore the islands of DK. She looks around the beach, since this is apparently the third time they've done this and never get further than that, but the two Kongs were nowhere in sight. Dixie then heads home thinking they've actually followed through with what the note says, figuring they'd be back in the morning. However, several days went by on the island, and the Kongs never returned. Alright, now something's fishy. By the time the second day comes and they're still not back, Dixie takes it upon herself to swim in the direction they usually go, south of DK Island, to the nearest mainland known as the Northern Hemisphere. Oh, okay, alright. Brilliant pun aside, she swam to the south, but ended up in a place referred to as the North. Maybe DK Island is just even further north from the mainland, but still, I find that kind of funny. In any case, once Dixie makes her way to the Cremisphere, that's where the game itself begins. She swims over to that starting island and talks to Wrinkly Kong, asking if she's seen the Kongs recently. She says they had apparently passed by some time ago, but she hasn't seen them since. Bizarre, since this exchange doesn't actually happen in the game, but whatever. She also tells Dixie to keep her eye out for the mystical banana birds. Yes, they're exactly what their name says, birds that are quite literally bananas, which have been scattered around the area. Dixie then meets up with Funky, teams up with Kitty, yada yada, I established this already. As the two Kongs journey to the nearby Lake Orangatanga with a boat they rented from Funky, they discovered that there's a Kremling presence in the area. Wow, who would have guessed that the Northern Hemisphere would have Kremlings present in it? Which obviously clues them into the fact that something fishy is going on here, and that DK and Diddy's prolonged absence may not have been voluntary on their part. Dixie and Kitty don't quite get a true idea as to what's going on until they travel through several areas of the Kremisphere and end up in Mykonos, an industrialized island reminiscent of Kremcock Industries, and meet up with Chaos. Yes, it's indeed spelled K-A-O-S, but I pronounce it as Chaos, as in disorder. Or the water monster, because it sounds way cooler than Chaos or Cows or whatever. He's a huge robot, and the commander of the new group of Kremlings, this time known as the Kremling Creeps. Ah yes, I'm sure this is definitely the only layer to this conspiracy. He is for sure the true villain, and there will in no way be a twist later on that reveals something absolutely unexpected. Presuming that Chaos has something to do with the disappearance of DK and Diddy, Dixie and Kitty vow to completely eliminate Chaos and get to the bottom of whatever's going on here. On the surface, this may seem to be yet another usual platformer plot, where the villain steals something or abducts a character that we now need to go and rescue. DKC 2, of course, revolved around Diddy and Dixie saving DK from the clutches of K. Rool to avoid giving away DK's banana hoard in a ransom, and now DKC 3 follows suit by having both DK and Diddy in need of help. However, in this game, the kidnapping is not explicit, and is rather implied by framing the whole thing around the two Kongs going missing. There's also a mystery and even conspiracy angle to it. What with the new commander of the Kremling Armada, all the new types of Kremlings, which I'll get to in a bit, and the ambiguity around the exact circumstances of how the Kongs went missing and where they currently are. If I'm making it sound terribly complex, it honestly really isn't. DKC 3 is still a story about a clan of monkeys battling against a goofy gang of reptiles and other animals. But I'd say this stuff adds an extra layer of intrigue that makes this plot even more interesting. I also find it pretty cool how Dixie gets her time in the spotlight, in much the same way her boyfriend did last time around, with her being the main playable character, as in the one you gain control of initially when starting the game, as well as the fact her name is prominently featured in the game's title. And speaking of that title, I like it a lot. Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. It just sounds good, and furthermore fits quite well, given how we have to rescue two Kongs instead of just one this time around. Dixie is given a chance to be a video game hero in her own right, but unlike last time where Diddy was prompted to do this by Cranky, and ultimately motivated by a desire to prove himself capable rather than solely saving his best friend, Dixie takes it completely upon herself to set out in search of the missing Kongs. In my opinion, that really demonstrates the strength of her character, since it proves how she's more than willing to charge headfirst into danger to help out her friends and family. This is actually a characterization detail introduced in DKC2's manual that I kinda glossed over, since that video was plenty long enough already. When Diddy says he's going to leave for Crocodile Isle, Dixie actually goes along with him out of her own volition, gladly insisting on aiding him in his journey, despite the fact he didn't want her to do so, due to how dangerous his quest would be. In this game, Dixie demonstrates her heroism and fearlessness once again, charging into a mysterious place she's never been before, since she knows things must not be going well for DK and Diddy. I rather like it, although I'd say it's a little unfortunate that there's not this huge thematic arc of Dixie overcoming insecurities or whatnot, like Diddy did in the previous game. But to be fair, she didn't really have any such thing in the first place, so whatever. Since this is a DKC game, Dixie is naturally not the only playable character. And as I said, she's joined by her infant cousin Kitty Kong. Despite the fact he's a literal toddler and was chewing on an old spare tire in Funky's Rentals when we initially meet him. No, I'm not kidding about that, it's in the manual. Kitty is a more than capable partner for the journey ahead, and he's able to pull his own weight, quite literally as we'll see soon. Lots of people seem to really hate Kitty, which I can somewhat get, but to be honest, I'm more so indifferent towards him. Not his character design as shown in promotional art, that shit's horrific. But as an actual character, I don't find him all that offensive. I will agree that he's fairly bland and doesn't really have many standout qualities of his own that set him apart from the other Kongs. In many ways, he's pretty much just a stand-in for DK, and if you ask me, he's not quite as memorable as the others. He's a toddler, like I said. He dresses in pajamas. His crying whenever you lose a life is pretty damn annoying. Although that's the case for pretty much every child that whines or cries, fictional or otherwise. Yeah, that's all I've got. I can only say I think Kitty is relatively forgettable in so many words, and to be honest, I have to agree with some that it may have been more compelling if Donkey Kong was playable again, and instead we had to save Diddy alongside Dixie. However, doing that may have taken some emphasis off of Dixie as the game's primary protagonist, since after all this series isn't called Dixie Kong Country, so therefore I can understand why they didn't do that. They wanted to make a game where Dixie was the primary star, playable DK would have interrupted that, so they made a new character. It's just that the new Kong they thought up is one that I find somewhat uninteresting, at least in comparison to the others in the series, which more or less leaves me with indifference towards him. Unfortunately, Kitty isn't the only Kong I find kinda weak in DKC 3, because if I'm to be honest, I think most of the Kong family members, all of whom returned from the previous games, are the weakest they've been in a while. That's not to say they're done poorly or whatever in this game, far from it, but when weighed against the dialogue and characterization they had before, especially from their appearances in the second game, I just don't think they have nearly as many standout lines and moments as they did before, which is a shame since since they were one of my favorite parts of the original two. I wouldn't say Wrinkly or Swanky were affected by this too much, since I've never had too terribly much to say about them. I do like their new character designs, with how Wrinkly appears suntanned and in a workout uniform, and how Swanky now looks even more boastful in his carnival game host outfit. But in general, their lines don't really jump out at me. Swanky now runs a circus game known as Swanky's Sideshow, and you can sometimes see Wrinkly playing video games, but honestly that's about it. Funky has also settled down to run his boat rental shop, and doesn't really have the whole surfer motif going on anymore. Instead, he's a mechanic now, and builds boats from parts you bring back to him after completing a world. Sure, that's cool and all, but I personally preferred his more radical persona, with his magical floating surfboard and all that. Those aspects of his character were what made Funky Kong, and now that they're more or less background elements, I mean, it's not like his personality was ruined or anything because of it, but he doesn't stick out as much for me. I don't mean to make it sound like these characters have no charm or personality whatsoever anymore, but again, by this series standards, I think they fall relatively short. However, with all of that said, the character I think has suffered the most significant downgrade in this game is definitely Cranky Kong, which is really unfortunate because he was always one of my favorite characters in the whole series. His grumpy old man personality, namely his vehement insistence on how much better things were back in his day, and constant fourth wall breaking gags made for an extremely funny presence in both the games themselves and their manuals. Cranky was especially strong in DKC 2, where I'd say his goofy cynicism was at its funniest, and additionally contributed to that game's strong thematic appeal, with how it was framed as an obstacle Diddy had to overcome to prove he was capable of being a strong gaming hero on his own. I've always found Cranky really funny, which is why it's such a shame that he was kinda done dirty in this game. Not because of anything that he says or does, but rather what he doesn't say. The issue is, he barely even appears at all in DKC 3. Yeah, unlike how there was a Cranky's Cabin in DKC 1 or the Monkey Museum in DKC 2, where you could go talk to Cranky and get gameplay tips, this game has no such thing. Instead, in the actual game, Cranky only appears as your opponent in Swanky's Sideshow. He has some pretty damn funny quotes for sure, but there's just so few of them. And if you don't bother with Swanky and just want to play the game, there's no easy way to see them. So that's unfortunate, but thankfully we've still got the manual. Maybe they've packed that full with some more silly Cranky lines. Well, no actually. I've read the entire thing, and there is absolutely no Cranky to speak of, besides a brief text blurb explaining his role in Swanky's Sideshow. That's really lame, to be honest. I don't know what else to say. I find that extremely disappointing after the incredible showing in the last few games. Really, I find this manual disappointing as a whole, since it seems to lack personality, instead being a basic, straight-faced manual with really standard instructions and whatnot. It does have a few highlights, like pointing out how Swanky's service is, quote, of course, the only one you have to pay for. But besides that, it all comes off as really milquetoast to me. In a vacuum, that's not so bad on its own, but when coming off of two other games with such hilarious and charming manuals, I don't know, it gives me the odd feeling they had run out of ideas for humor in these games, or had a strict deadline to get this manual done or something. To look on the bright side though, this game does have one decently strong group of characters, and it's the entirely new addition that I mentioned earlier, the Brothers Bear. In total, there's 13 of these guys spread out around the northern hemisphere, all living in log cabin establishments located in various places throughout the overworld and submaps. Each one has an alliterative name, featuring a single word starting with the letter B that describes their personality or profession, which goes along with the fact that they're, well, bears. As a whole, I find these guys' personalities pretty fun, and I like seeing how they get creative with theming them around the areas they appear, the service they provide, or some other aspect of their character, while still keeping the consistency of naming them a word that fits said traits and starts with a letter B. For example, Bazooka is an army general who has a huge cannon from his days in the Crimean War, Brash is a prideful jock who gets very upset if anyone challenges his accomplishments, and Blue is sad that no one brought him a present for his birthday and pretty much forgot about it entirely, leaving him alone to wallow in his depression. Poor guy. Anyway, like I said, I love these characters, and in my opinion, they have the strongest personalities in the game overall. While you don't interact with them a whole ton, every time you do, they often say or do something amusing. For example, after beating one of the stages in under a minute and 15 seconds, Brash here gets really upset that you beat his record, and throws what's essentially a temper tantrum that causes a tremor, which I find pretty funny. On top of that, I really like their designs, namely Bazooka's huge, ridiculous army general mustache, Baffle's tropical shirt and goofy ponytail, Benny and Bjorn's traditional northern European clothing, Brash's fiery red fur and track and field uniform, Barnacle's fisherman getup, and Boomer's construction worker outfit, complete with a yellow hard hat. All in all, these guys are a pretty fun addition to the cast, and I'm glad they were included. Oh yeah, and since I have nowhere else to mention this, I think Chaos is a fascinating new villain for the series, with his intimidating appearance and cold, calculating, Terminator-like personality that's incredibly fitting for an evil robot. Although I can kinda take or leave the Kremlings this time around, at least in terms of their role in the story, since they more so feel like they're there out of obligation and series tradition rather than adding a bunch to the plot. I do think they have some cool design motifs, as I'll touch on later, but apart from that, eh. Although speaking of, I think the graphics in this game are kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they're surely the most high density they've been yet, and feature the most detailed sprites and environments in the trilogy. I mean, just take a look around at pretty much anything in this game and you'll see what I'm talking about. To my eyes anyway, this game's visuals are really dense and detailed, featuring an impressive degree of complexity for the system, and everything is just as, if not more visually refined than even DKC2. By this point, I can tell that Rareware had fully mastered the tried and true model compression technique they'd been using since 1994. And DKC3's graphical assets managed to maintain a solid amount of the detail that was likely present on the original models, which themselves were definitely more complex than the models created for the previous games on their own. I have to give special attention to the backgrounds, which are almost unbelievable with how rich and detailed they are. Additionally, while the game's level themes aren't necessarily the most original in the world, often using tropes we've seen before in the series like ice caps, factories, and jungles, the way they look is original enough that I don't really mind all that much. And the extra detail they have in this game really makes them pop. For example, the factories don't look anything like the ones from Kremkrock Industries. Whereas those had a more clean and modern appearance, with loads of flaming oil drums, this game's factories are weathered, rustic, and way darker, which makes it feel like they're straight out of the Industrial Revolution or some shit. In addition, they've got huge open vats of acid or molten metal, and large furnaces, aspects that I'd say makes these levels feel more like the industrialized lair of a mad scientist, rather than a typical factory meant for fabricating goods. These stages look really awesome in my opinion, and they're for certain one of my favorite level themes in this game. I also really like how these huge forests where you jump around on massive trees look, since instead of repeating the Endor look this theme had in DKC1, now you go inside the trees themselves, which seem like something out of Redwood National Park with their massive canopies that seem to stretch out almost infinitely. With that laid out though, this game does have its fair share of unique looking areas, which stand out as distinctly its own. These places are rather interesting to look at in my opinion, and are some of my favorite types of areas in DKC3 has to offer. For instance, you have the docks, or boardwalks, or whatever you want to call them, the mountainsides, the waterfall cliffs, and the enchanted riverbanks. All of these areas look really nice visually, and have some genuine atmospheric appeal to them, which makes them some of the game's most memorable environments to be sure. The docks have this gorgeous background, which heavily smacks of the Pacific Northwest, or Atlantic Northeast, basically one of those regions which lies between the northern US and southern Canadian borders. It has undoubtedly the most gorgeous water in this series, and by extension on the SNES. The mountains in the background are also incredibly nice looking, and there's even this neat effect baked right into the water that gives the illusion of a reflection. As far as I know, neither of the previous games did something like that, so that's something totally unique to DKC3, which I have to give props to this game for. Also, I find the docks themselves, or stilt villages if you will, really cool on their own, so yeah, there's that too. This is without a doubt one of the most gorgeous level themes in series history if you ask me, and that's just the first one you encounter. The mountainsides have one of the most detailed backgrounds in the entire game, which almost resembles the Grand Canyon or just generally the rocky desert areas in the southern US states such as New Mexico or Colorado. A little weird given how I said the docks look straight out of Canada, but I'd say it oddly fits. The enchanted riverbanks also fittingly have an almost mystical appearance with their mushrooms. I think that's what these are, and big trees, which makes them seem like they belong in a fairy tale. It almost feels like we're gonna come across a log cabin with an anthropomorphic bear living inside of it. Oh, wait! I'm starting to see what the brothers Bear were likely inspired by. At any rate, these riverbanks have some more really beautiful water, albeit not quite as outwardly impressive as that from the boardwalk levels. And some individual stages even feature additional effects, such as a lightning storm. However, my favorite stage aesthetic this game has to offer, that only it has, is no doubt the cliffsides with the waterfalls. Waterfalls are already one of my favorite level archetypes in any game, and hell, in real life as well, for that matter, since I've always loved the balance of serenity and controlled chaos they invoke. I find the way waterfalls look to be cool as hell, calming, and intriguing all at once, even if they are as simple as water plus gravity. And the soundscape of true, pure random noise that comes along with them gives me peace of mind that few other things can. And those feelings are present in these stages in full force for me. Their sheer height on its own is something to behold, rivaling the mine shafts from the previous game, and the rocky cliff faces that make up the ground and much of the background present here is similarly detailed to the rest of the game's aesthetics. I also really like how there's flowers and grass growing, even in such an elevated area, because they give a sense of life to a region that could have easily felt like a barren wasteland if not given the proper care. The star of the show is, of course, the aforementioned waterfalls, which almost remind me of the ones featured in Sonic. You know, those ones that were tiled to give the illusion of transparency on old CRTs. Except on the SNES, I'd say the transparency effects are a lot more convincing, even when viewing the raw sharp pixel output provided by emulation, which I'm using, or upscaling, allowing for a really nice effect no matter how you're viewing the game. Also, can I just say, I love love these areas where there's a rocky arch that goes behind a waterfall in particular. It makes me feel like I'm in some kind of hangout spot, and like I could spend hours here just sitting around if it were in real life. Thankfully, you can do that given how the DKC games don't have time limits in their levels, a crucial improvement over other platformers that I just never bothered to bring up until now. Good job, me. I'm surprised I didn't get any comments about that. Anyway, these waterfall stages are sick visually, and that's all I can say about them. With all that in mind, however, for as detailed and gorgeous as DKC3's visuals can be, I also think the game has its fair share of shortcomings in this regard. It's not like I think any aspect of this game looks bad or anything in that vein. For the SNES especially, it's absolutely gorgeous. However, when you compare some of the more fine-grained details at play here, I find this game has several aspects that are sort of lacking, especially after what the previous games accomplished. For one, while we're still on the topic of the game's level aesthetics, DKC3 kinda seems like it wants to go for a unique theme, which I love in theory. I went on about this in my previous video, but an easy way to make a game leave an impact visually is to give it a striking theme which makes it stand out from its contemporaries. I felt that DKC2 did this exceptionally well with the whole pirate thing it had going on, which was reflected in its enemies and many of its stage environments. Even if a particular type of stage didn't really seem to fit in with the pirate theme on the surface, the game managed to squeeze it in and make the whole thing work extremely well, which I felt made it stand out so much more, in addition to being a huge step up from the more general theming that DKC1 went for. So following that extremely high standard, how does DKC3 deliver in this regard? Well, to be honest, it's kinda complicated, but overall I feel it was a step down all things considered. To play devil's advocate, I find the Northern Hemisphere has some pretty neat ideas on its own, as I've gone into already. As a whole, the area is this interesting archipelago home to lakes, mountains, caves, and huge forests. And in general, the entire thing feels like it was heavily inspired by Canadian wilderness. It's definitely a distinct area that's hard not to notice, and when I see something out of this game, I can immediately recognize where it came from. In that sense, I can say that DKC3 has an equally distinct look as its predecessors, which is admirable as always. However, where I start to notice things I'm not as keen on comes in with how this game attempts to craft an identity for itself. Put simply, I find DKC3 has something of an identity crisis, and that it doesn't really know what theme it wants to go for. I did mention how the game has lots of areas that wouldn't be out of place in Canada, so you may be tempted to say that it's themed around the Great White North, but in reality, it's not that clean and simple. In addition to that, this game also has numerous aspects that point to it wanting to embrace a science fiction theme of sorts. There's the game's main antagonist, Chaos, the gigantic robotic leader of the Kremlings who's heavily reminiscent of the Terminator, and on top of that, the game, as mentioned, contains factories that look like they belong to some mad scientist. However, where this is easily the most notable is in the enemy designs themselves. In a similar spirit to how DKC2 made all of its Kremling enemies pirates, DKC3's incarnation of the crocodile baddies makes them appear really ugly. In a good way. That's confusing. Why don't we back up a little bit? By this, I mean they were made ugly on purpose, to make them seem as if they were genetic mutants created in a laboratory. Like someone or something was attempting to engineer the perfect battle Kremlings. I mean, for example, take the bazooka, which is one of my favorite Kremling designs for sure. He's this tiny little thing holding an oversized bazooka, which typically shoots out barrels of some kind. While that's pretty funny, it's stuff like this that also evokes a sense of utilitarianism for this batch of Kremlings, giving the sense that they're artificial life forms that were only given the minimum proportions and equipment they needed to accomplish their goals. It's a cool motif to theme the enemies around, in my opinion, and while it admittedly doesn't always work out perfectly, and we could sometimes get designs that I think are downright forgettable or sometimes unappealing even given their intent, for the most part I like the enemy designs on display here. I don't even mind the fact that they replaced the series staple zingers with the robotic buzzes, because if you ask me, the latter fits the theme of this game way more, even as someone who prefers zingers myself. As I said, all of these aspects clue me into the fact that they more than likely wanted to go for a sci-fi theme for this game, which I would have been fully on board with. It's such a strong, fun idea for a DKC game, and I would have loved to see how they could have gotten creative in making various stage aesthetics that blended nature with industry and whatnot, to give the game an intriguing visual dichotomy. Okay, maybe that's my inner Sonic enjoyer speaking, but still. However, I don't feel they executed it all that well, because in my opinion, they don't really try to mix the two categories of stage aesthetics that I brought up. On top of that, they also seem to want to mix in a sort of classic monster movie theme as well, specifically with some of the bosses. Maybe they're meant to be genetically modified as well, but to me they seem like naturally occurring creatures that we're only fighting because they happen to be in our way. Oh yeah, and they even threw a fourth one in there, that being lost mythical environments with an air of magic and mystery to them. It's this hodgepodge of ideas that I feel aren't mixed together with the proper grace, which makes this game feel almost tired and confused. And in my opinion, it seems as though it wasn't really properly thought out. For my money, the main issue here is the lack of a central unifying idea that ties everything together in a cohesive whole. On the whole, the game's various ideas feel very non-committal. Like Like, the devs couldn't quite pick which exact theme they wanted to design the game's visuals around, and so they instead decided to include all of them, without considering the ramifications of doing so, thereby leaving DKC3 feeling unfocused when it comes to theming. Again, I find that somewhat disappointing after the likes of DKC2, which, while also varied in its aesthetics, framed everything around the spirit of pirates, specifically the adventure and perils that one would expect when pitted up against them. Hell, I'd actually even say DKC1 did this aspect a little better, at least in terms of consistency, and you can tell they wanted it to be themed around a jungle island. It wasn't the most mind-blowing thing in the world, and a few stages could be considered outliers, but it was generally consistent, as opposed to DKC3, which is kind of all over the place. Like I went into, I think it would have been in their best interest to focus on one of the themes, and then just go crazy with it, thinking of aesthetics that fit in while being distinct and recognizable on their own. My ideal situation for this would be, again, if they had played into that sci-fi thing a lot more, and framed the plot around taking back the Northern Hemisphere from Chaos and his band of genetic mutants, all the while restoring its natural beauty once again in addition to rescuing the missing Kongs. I think that would have been really damn cool. There's already a hint of it in there with Bramble, a botanist from the Brothers Bear, goddamn, say that fast 10 times, who says that his flowers were being killed by Chaos after the island housing Mechanos had been converted to the industrial wasteland it currently is. I find that interesting, but alas, this is the only time such a thing is brought up in this game. I think that's a huge missed opportunity, and it could have easily been the jumping off point for yet another strong thematic through line to rival or potentially even surpass the likes of DKC2's offerings. But I guess it just wasn't meant to be. A shame truly, because I see a great deal of potential lurking around in this game, a lot of which I feel was sadly wasted. Overall, I'd still say the Northern Hemisphere is a neat setting in many ways. I wouldn't remember it whatsoever if I didn't believe that. But I think it's the weakest area from the entire trilogy, because all things considered, it drops the ball the most for me when it comes to creating a place with a consistent theme, even with those nitpicks I levied towards DKC1 back in that video. What certainly doesn't help matters either is the fact that I think this game takes several steps back in terms of presentation as well, namely when talking about its color palette and charming character details conveyed through animation, or to be more precise, the lack thereof. As with the other things about this game's visuals, it's not like DKC3 totally lacks these things. There's several exceptions. Those aforementioned factory stages have some pretty nice splashes of color, namely with their liquid metal and acid, as do the treetops, jungles, and riverbanks. And the characters do have a few animations that give them some degree of charm. As always, there's the idle animations and switching, which are pretty entertaining. Dixie's idle animation is strangely missing the part where she sits down and takes a sip from a juice box, but there's at least still the animation of her chewing gum and blowing a bubble with it. Kitty's is plain funny, because the young Kong just sits down and looks around all confused, like he doesn't know where he even is. I also like how their switching animations show the Kongs pranking each other, with how Kitty grabs Dixie and drops her behind himself, and when Dixie startles him into allowing her into the lead by popping a bubblegum bubble. Also, I have to mention when you win a bonus room as Kitty, because he stares right at you and perks up his eyebrows, which I'd say is the game's funniest animation by far. In general, the game's actual animation work is as superb as always, and while the larger sprites can still move like puppets on occasion, I'd say it complements the character designs quite well. Although, because I can't think of anywhere else to bring this up, the promotional renders are hella cursed. Some aspects, such as Dixie Kong, look fine, but some of the enemies have these dead eyes that make them appear more disturbing than was likely intended. Kitty Kong is without a doubt the cream of the crop when it comes to this. I mean, just look at those eyes. There's nothing in there. But hey, at least its sprites look normal. As I was saying, the Kongs have some pretty entertaining and expressive animations. But when compared to the previous games, there's not quite as many little character details that give them that extra bit of life. When I say that, I'm referring to stuff like how your Kongs stumble on the edge of a pit in DKC1, or how when clinging to the walls in DKC2's hive levels, you can see Dixie start to lick the honey off the wall if you stand still for a moment. These kinds of things served as small yet solid characterization, and made the game's leads come off as living, breathing characters rather than just lifeless sprites. That's not to say this series was what invented idle animations or other little bits of character animation in games, but in my opinion, these games are easily some of the strongest examples of this being put into practice, except for DKC3, which, again, I'd argue is notably weaker in this regard. That doesn't only apply to the Kongs themselves, mind you. I'd say it's the case for all the game's characters. In my experience, the enemies don't seem to exhibit the distinct personalities they once did, and appear a lot more flat and lifeless. You do have Crumple, who does a bring it on gesture if you jump on his head as Dixie, Copter, who hilariously uses 2 helicopter blades to spin himself around and fly, and I still find the way this game's equivalent to clobbers, referred to as nakas, really sick name choice by the way, Rare, run around to be rather funny. Especially with how they now wave their arms in the air like madmen. But that's honestly about it. When I try to think of other enemies, I basically blank on most of them, since their lack of identifiable personalities makes them way less memorable in my opinion. I'm sure you're sick of hearing that by now, since I'm basically bludgeoning you over the head with it, but as with Kiddy Kong, I can only say so much when this game leaves me with so little when it comes to one of the many things I love this series so much for. So why don't we move on, huh? I also mentioned how I think this game can be lacking when it comes to its color palette sometimes. Again, it does have its moments, namely a few of those level themes I mentioned. Oh yeah, and the drain pipe stages, which because I'm a well-organized individual who is consistently on top of things, I forgot to bring up. Yeah, these look pretty cool and oftentimes have a solid amount of color on their own, such as the strong greens of Low-G Labyrinth or the potent purple from Poisonous Pipeline. Jesus, you think I should be writing tongue twisters instead of shitty game reviews on YouTube? Anyways, apart from these stage archetypes, however, I find that this game can be fairly starved for color, and it often features a lot of grays, beiges, and browns, to the detriment of more colorful areas. I'm not saying every single level has to be made up of rainbow vomit, but in my opinion, DKC3 inhabits a place closer to the other extreme end of the spectrum, having comparatively fewer colors, which I feel would have made the game's environments pop that much more. For instance, take a look at the cave levels, and you may begin to see what I mean. While they undeniably possess a marvelous amount of detail when it comes to raw pixel density, as well as some extremely well-rendered stalactites and stalagmites, I find them pretty flat and boring to look at because, well, they're basically a smear of brown, gray, brown, black, and more brown. Did I mention brown? In my eyes, these levels are desperately begging for some extra environmental flourishes, which could have added that splash of color that would have given them more life. I mean, if DKC2 could do it as well as it did 1 year earlier, then I don't see why this game couldn't have in all cases. Take that game's mineshafts for example. Their backgrounds have these glistening crystals with shimmering warm colors, which provides a nice contrast to the cools of the background foreground rocks, creating a stage aesthetic that really sticks out in my mind. Same thing applies to its amusement park levels, with the strong reds, greens, and blues featured on the circus tents and Ferris wheels in the distance. Or even something like the Zinger Hives with their vibrant orange tones. In general, what that game does is the sort of thing I'm looking for, specifically with how each of its stage aesthetics had a unique color palette that sometimes slightly changed between individual levels. Instead, this game kind of falls into the DKC1 trap, where a lot of its level themes tend to share very similar colors, which for some reason seems to settle on brown and beige a lot, as I said. I wouldn't say it's limited to literally just 5 primary colors like I found DKC1 mostly was, but when compared to its predecessor especially, I find it severely lacking. I already brought up the caves, but there's also the mountainsides, which yes, I do find cool, like I said a bit ago, but that's mostly in spite of an admittedly kinda boring selection of colors most levels with the theme have. Similarly, while the mill levels are a sweet idea, they're too plagued by bland brown and beige shades that I feel don't stand out. I don't want to make it seem like I hate brown or something, because I don't, but when it's the primary color accenting what feels like 70% of the game's levels, it tends to wear on me and get really boring to look at after a while. For me, it makes the game feel more lifeless than it would otherwise, even with the impressive amount of detail that permeates through its visuals. Ultimately, this, and everything else I've been discussing here, leaves me with somewhat mixed and conflicted feelings towards this game's looks. On one hand, the sprites and environments are absurdly detailed even by DKC standards. There's some fascinating ideas for level aesthetics, and there's a solid foundation for a really cool motif with the setting and enemies. But on the other, I find the color palette less varied, the characters lacking in charming animations, and the theming weak, confused, and unfocused due to the devs not really settling on something and rolling with it. I do not dislike this game's visuals, and to be frank, I'd say DKC3 actually looks nicer than the first game because of how much more advanced it is in terms of rendering. But as I've surely made clear by now, its graphics are a roller coaster of ups and downs. As you'll see the longer this video goes on for, that's kind of a running theme with practically everything about this game. Which brings me to another famous aspect of this series I've spent an extreme amount of time discussing in these videos, the soundtrack. If you need a refresher, Donkey Kong Country is legendary for its iconic music, and features numerous examples that have cemented themselves as some of gaming's most well-known songs. Jungle Hijinks, Aquatic Ambience, Gangplank Galleon, Stickerburst Symphony, Forest Interlude, Bayou Boogie, and so many more. You're more than likely already aware of the pedigree this series' music has, all due to the talented work of Evelyn Novakovic, Robin Beanland, and of course David Wise, in bringing these soundtracks to life. With that being said, I usually hear this praise in reference to the first two games' music, and not as much DKC3. It gets brought up for sure, and people generally enjoy it, but I don't see it mentioned nearly as much as prior games. That's a neutral fact inherently, but I figured I would bring it up since it's a little weird to me. Anyway, my feelings toward this game's soundtrack are, once again, a bit complicated. I'll just rip the band-aid off. I personally think this is the series' weakest OST so far. It's by no means bad, has several strengths of its own, and is home to a few tracks I'd even consider some of my favorites in the trilogy. It's just that, in the grand scheme of things, I tend to prefer the compositions from previous two games for several reasons. For starters, David Wise is no longer the primary composer for this game, and he took a relative backseat. His contributions are limited to things like the title screen, bonus rooms, map screen services, and other side quest stuff. Honestly, I'm a little bummed out that this is the case, since his work on DKC 1 and especially DKC 2, the latter of which he composed like 99% of the music for, were some of the most brilliant tracks this series has to offer. But hey, I'm glad he was involved with DKC 3 in some capacity, and he provides some really good stuff as always. Dixie Beat alone is one of my favorite tracks, and to be honest, it's my pick for the series' best title screen theme. It's this bombastic remix of Bonus Room Blitz that I'd say perfectly embodies the fun-loving spirit of this franchise. And being a remake of a track from a previous game showcases how much more sophisticated the series' sound quality has become since then. I also really love Bonus Time, which may just be my favorite bonus room track in the series as well, though I'm not totally sure about that. The song almost sounds like something from a game show, like when the contestants have a limited time to answer a question or complete some challenge or... oh yeah. Although it's weird how this game reuses the same winning and losing jingles as DKC 2, when they were created to fit in with that game's bonus room theme. Not a huge deal, just something I noticed. My favorite of Wise's tracks in this game, however, is probably the Brothers Bear theme. It's this groovy rock and roll type piece with a punchy piano lead and killer bass line, which I can't get enough of. I only wish the loop was a little longer because as is, it's only 20 seconds and therefore gets repetitive after a while. But regardless of that, great song. It's also pretty funny how Wrinkly will sometimes be playing on an N64 when you enter her save cave. And whenever that happens, you can hear a familiar theme remixed in the SNES sound font. Well, next thing you know, there's going to be an Italian plumber and a bunch of mushrooms showing up. So that's cool, but like I was saying, these contributions from David Wise are more or less a background element now, which I find unfortunate because he basically was the closest thing to a serious composer by this point. His unique style just fit this franchise better than anyone else in my opinion. So seeing him take a backseat right after his magnum opus one game ago was just kind of a shame. I would have loved to see what he could have done with this game's setting, but alas, it wasn't meant to be. Instead, Evelyn Novakovic, who had been a secondary composer for the series since its debut, took the reins for DKC 3 and composed all the main level and map screen themes, well over 2/3 of the soundtrack. Inherently, this is fine, especially since Novakovic is talented herself and has produced several great songs of her own for this series. But with that said, I nonetheless prefer Wise's style overall, since Novakovic's tends to have a heavy emphasis on atmosphere which ends up overpowering the melody. Think Voices of the Temple, Misty Menace, or Northern Hemispheres if you need a reference point. That's not a bad thing in and of itself, but for a series focused on a clan of monkeys jumping around on goofy crocodile baddies, I just don't think it fits nearly as well, and many of DKC3's tracks fall into that category for me, as opposed to DKC2's phenomenal OST, which was bursting at the seams with personality, balancing bombastic melodies with deep atmosphere. DKC3 seems to emphasize a comparatively more low-key sound that's extremely heavy on the bass, giving it a more dour tone overall, and as a result, I find a few of its songs less memorable than I would have preferred. However, not all of them are like this, and as I said, some are even a few of my favorites in the series. Several bring out the best of Novakovic's compositional style, and either have some really nice melodies or atmosphere that works to their benefit. Namely, I quite like Mill Fever, Frosty Frolics, Enchanted Riverbank, and Boss Boogie. Mill Fever reminds me heavily of Treetop Rock, with how it's low-key yet quite groovy and catchy. Frosty Frolic sounds like a track that would play during an oncoming snowstorm, as if it was forecast for the next day and the clouds are just starting to arrive as you're doing something else. Enchanted Riverbank almost sounds like the intro theme to a kid's wildlife show, while also including mystical undertones that fit the riverside areas quite well. And and Boss Boogie is a badass theme for the boss fights, with a dark industrial grunge to it that I'd say reflects their Hollywood monster movie designs extremely well. Additionally, I've got to give a shout out to Waterworld, a song that embodies the true horror of the deep ocean so well that it's basically the official theme song for all deep sea areas for me, such as the Marianas Trench, where I can just imagine it playing as you look out the window of your submersible and observe the almost otherworldly creatures that live down there. And finally, a secret song that only plays if you enter the cheat code Mary when starting the game. It's a Christmas Easter egg that swaps the stars in every Collect the Stars minigame to ornaments, and also replaces the bonus room theme with the track Jangle Bells. Even though this song definitely doesn't have its appeal year-round, it's perfect when it gets to be this time of year, which I'm thankfully doing this video around. I don't know if I managed to get it out before the year ended as I'm writing, of course, but regardless, solid track. Oh, and yeah, Jungle Jitter is also decent. It's my least favorite jungle theme from these games, but still solid in my opinion. My favorite songs in this game, though, can be boiled down to 3 specific tracks, those being Rockface Rumble, Nuts and Bolts, and Cascade Capers. For me personally, these are the tracks that immediately spring to mind whenever DKC3's soundtrack comes up in any capacity, and to be honest, I think they're some of the trilogy's best songs. Rockface Rumble, which plays during the mountainside levels, is a rather interesting one, because believe it or not, the track is actually a remix of Mining Melancholy from DKC2. No, seriously, take a listen to both songs and you'll see I'm telling the truth. This song gives me an oddly climactic feeling, like this is the last journey we're going to go on with the Kongs. We've reached the final chapter of the trilogy, and it's time to kick Chaos's ass real good, so we can save DK and Diddy and restore things to normal once again. Quite fitting, because this literally was the last game in the series for a while. Nuts and Bolts is a similarly intense theme that sets the tone for the factory stages, and it fittingly creates a mood of immense danger as well as a sense that there's countless deadly hazards looming nearby. In addition to that, what do you know, the track incorporates sound effects that fit in with the environment on display, including mechanical noise from the massive machines in the factory as well as what sounds like laser guns, and puts a sick reverb effect on the backing synth crawl. All in all, I love this track, and while I personally prefer Fear Factory for its triumphant sound that's expertly mixed with intensity of its own, this song is certainly no slouch either. Out of these 3, however, my favorite song is probably Cascade Capers, the track for the waterfall stages, which is by extension my favorite song in the game. Put simply, the track is just majestic, and much like the game's other best songs, goes along with the levels it plays in so well. In fact, I would say it does so practically perfectly, and it sounds like an audible representation of a waterfall. And no, that's not only because of the falling water noise that plays alongside the central melody. It's also due to how the melody itself seems to cascade down and out in much the same way as I don't know, a waterfall. Additionally, I tend to associate this song with quiet, still places, namely standing in a shower at 6 AM where the only thing illuminating the room is a yellow nightlight. Alright, I'll admit that's bizarrely specific, but it's what I associate this song with. I just remember taking morning showers during high school with those exact conditions, and sometimes even these days, and pretty much every time this song starts playing in my head, I swear. I haven't the damnedest clue where this started, maybe it's the common element of flowing water, but because of that, this is a song inexorably linked to calm, still circumstances for me, despite being themed around water doing, well, the exact opposite of that. So yeah, as I've said, this game has several fantastic songs on its own, which I feel are well within the series' quality standard in this regard. I wouldn't say most are as strong as many of the tracks from the first 2 games, but on their own, the ones I've mentioned so far are quite good. By contrast though, DKC3 also has numerous tracks that I don't dislike. Like, I don't think there's any actually bad songs in this game, but comparatively, a bunch come off as too dour, downbeat, and unfitting for the series in my opinion, which makes me remember them a lot less than others. In fact, before playing this game before this video, I actually didn't remember many of these songs' melodies, because to be frank, a lot of them are overpowered by the immense focus on atmosphere. As I've been saying, this is not a bad approach to making video game music in and of itself, and in the right context, I think such a musical direction can be admirable or even ideal. But in this series about cartoon monkeys beating the crap out of lizards, I personally prefer something with more catchy melodies that uses atmosphere as an enhancer, rather than the whole focus. Unfortunately, many of DKC3's songs take the latter approach, as I've said. I'm talking about stuff like Treetop Tumble, Pokey Pipes, Northern Cremisphere, Submap Shuffle, and Crystal Chasm. For what these songs are, I'd say they're all okay, but as DKC tracks, I think they're, like I said, way too dour for their own good. Many go the way of Voices of the Temple and are way too heavy on the bass, such as Pokey Pipes. Whereas others sound like they'd belong in some kind of depressing cutscene rather than a level from a goofy, charming series such as DKC. All the other tracks I just mentioned suffer from these issues in a similar way, with the two overworld songs being the trilogy's weakest map themes by far if you ask me. There's also stuff such as Hot Pursuit, which, while not as guilty as these things, still isn't particularly memorable for me. However, the peak, or rather nadir if you will, for this trend is easily Cavern Caprice, the game's underground theme. This is by far the game's most boring, droning track in my opinion, and for me it's extraordinarily bland and dull, which makes the already slow cave stages an even more tedious affair. You see, that's the thing. Well, again, I wouldn't say any of these tracks are badly composed or anything like that. Their overemphasis on low atmospheric sounds and deep bassy leading instruments is less than ideal for my tastes, which comes to the detriment of melodies that leave a strong impression on me, instead just being kind of forgettable. Like I went into a bit ago, Evelyn Novakovic's musical stylings often seem to follow this trend, and Jesus, I hope this doesn't sound rude or disrespectful, but it's just not the kind of music I'm looking for in a platformer like this. Novakovic is undeniably talented, like I've said, and has even produced numerous fantastic tracks for this series. Personally, I vastly prefer the direction that David Wise's music takes, specifically that nice balance between atmosphere and melody I've brought up numerous times now. I'm sure it sounds like I'm repeating myself a lot, even more than usual, and it's because my reasoning for thinking this game's soundtrack is the weakest of the three is really that simple. Many of its tracks just don't stand out to me as much as some of its other ones, for as strong as some of those can be. And it's generally not a consistently amazing OST, as was the standard set by DKC2 for example. I don't mean to say that every soundtrack in the series has to match or even surpass what many, including myself, consider the musical peak of the franchise, because that's asking a lot. However, I'd say even DKC1 had more consistently stellar music, even with its occasionally weaker tracks. So all I'm really asking for is something with mostly memorable themes. Sadly, I don't think DKC3 manages to accomplish this, since about half of its tracks are more akin to DKC1's lesser songs. As I've been repeatedly saying, not bad, but forgettable enough to get lost in the fold for me, which I feel is a massive shame after the high standards this series had long established by this point. But hey, maybe the opening stage theme will be the one to redeem this whole thing. I mean, the previous two games had such strong openers, it's basically series tradition by now. DKC1 came in with these dense jungle sounds, as drums gradually faded in, which culminated in an iconic, fun-loving melody that perfectly set the tone of the wacky, yet still resonant journey ahead. DKC2 started out on a large pirate ship, the Gangplank Galleon to be precise, and emphasized that with the creaking sounds of its massive deck alongside the calming flow of the water underneath it. This level 2 had a melody slowly fade in from behind the soundscape, which was a calming sea shanty that called attention to how, while we had a long, dangerous journey ahead of us, we could heed for a moment and take in the calming atmosphere of this area before truly diving into the deep end, so to speak. These songs helped those games make solid first impressions, and set the expectations for those games' musical presentation properly. So after those strong openers for 2 games straight, how exactly does DKC3's first stage open up? I feel like there's a word for this situation. Oh yeah, lame. Okay, so the presentation and aesthetic qualities of this game are kind of mixed in my opinion, taking several steps forward in some ways and huge steps back in others. In theory, however, that's not a huge deal. I would argue those aspects are still important, since when done exceptionally well, they can greatly enhance a game, which is especially the case in a series such as DKC, where there's such paramount elements to its appeal. Ultimately though, those things are in service of the game itself, which is of course the most important part. That's why DKC is one of my favorite platforming franchises, because in addition to being friggin' gorgeous and having some of gaming's most iconic music, they're also a masterclass in how to make a great platformer. I've had a lot to say about these games' gameplay so far, and many repeat playthroughs as well as analyzing what makes them tick has only grown my appreciation for them further. So how does DKC 3 cap all that off? Well, I wish I could give a clear-cut, clean answer, but as is the running theme with this game, my feelings towards how it plays are pretty complicated. In general, I'd say the game has a lot of the same strengths that the previous ones did, and at its best even contains some of the finest pockets of gameplay in the series. By that same token, I also think it's matched by some pretty overpowering flaws, and tends to have some of the absolute bottom-of-the-barrel worst moments in the series' history as well. All at completely sporadic intervals, might I add. I'll have even more to say when I get into the more specific aspects of this game's design and whatnot, but for now, its general aspects are mostly pretty solid. At the very least, everything I praised about the controls of the previous games is still here and accounted for. DKC 3 uses the exact same physics and movement as its predecessors, and the minor improvements that DKC 2 introduced are still present as well, namely briefly freezing in place when you toss a barrel or object after jumping. It's as solid as ever, and moving around is just as fun as it's always been for me in these games. Additionally, several staple moves make a return, such as Dixie's helicopter hair, which is just as powerful a platforming tool as in DKC 2. It controls the exact same, just hold the action button after jumping, which on the SNES controller is the Y button, and you'll fall much slower, therefore allowing you to travel much longer distances and land tricky or precise jumps with ease. Despite having played this game more than once, I still find it to be an invaluable platforming tool that comes in handy in numerous situations throughout. Alongside that, the really powerful somersault move is also present, and I'd say it's just as useful as always. It's a fantastic offensive option, allowing you to take down basically any enemy as either character, and also lets you extend your jumps with coyote frames. Yada yada, it's more satisfying than other instances of coyote frames since it's not automatic. It acts as a fantastic speedrunning tool that can help you keep the game's pace up with increased skill. It's all the same as it ever was, and I find it really useful. Although I feel I should mention that the game never really requires it, at least in the main stages, unlike how DKC 2 was, where it was occasionally needed to progress. I'm not totally sure how to feel about that, but my mind immediately goes to indifference, since it doesn't really matter either way for me. If it was required, cool, it's another excuse to use the satisfying move. But if not, who the hell cares? I'm going to use it anyway. Regardless of whether it's optional, I'm glad this move is back. And they didn't pull some nonsense where it was suddenly and arbitrarily removed just because. Fitting in with that trend is also a move introduced in DKC 2, the team-up ability, which is both the same and somewhat different to how it was in its debut. At a base level, the move functions in basically the exact same way. You press the A button, which on other controllers translates to the leftmost face button. Upon doing this, your Kong partner will hop onto your shoulders, and while in this state, pressing the Y button and aiming with the D-pad will either cause your partner to be thrown upwards, which you can use to get up to higher areas that would otherwise be unreachable, or horizontally, which acts as a pretty solid attack option capable of eliminating a fair few enemies in the game, albeit not nearly as many as DKC 2's version of the move could. It's fun to use and rather helpful in several instances, and as such, I'm glad it was carried over, much like the somersault. That being said, this move is also different insofar as your choice of Kong actually affects how it works. Namely, throwing around the two Kongs has different results from each other. If you're playing as Kitty and team up with Dixie on your shoulders, the move is essentially the same as it was before, but if you have Kitty on your back, he's noticeably heavier, which limits the range you're able to throw him but makes it so you're able to break through weak sections of ground. On the boardwalk levels. Yeah, that's it. I like the idea of making the Kongs have different physical properties, an element that took a bit of a backseat in DKC 2, but with how situational this is, it honestly doesn't even matter. Though if you want to talk situational, look no further than Kitty Kong's water skip move. If you roll off of a platform above water, and then repeatedly press the jump button within an extremely awkward and picky timing window as you hit its surface, you can skip across the water like a stone. This move is required a grand total of 2 times throughout the entire game, and only if you plan to go for 103% completion anyhow, which I'll get to, and in my opinion, it's plainly not fun to use whatsoever. So honestly, I'm glad it's not used very often. But at that point, I have to wonder why they even bothered programming it. Maybe it was originally intended to be used more often, but still, I've always been puzzled by that, especially now. In any case, in addition to the game's base moveset, DKC 3 once again brings back animal buddies, one of the most famous aspects aspects of this series. I've made it no secret that animal buddies are one of my favorite parts of the trilogy's gameplay, and that I think they were a really clever way of adding power-ups to a series where they otherwise wouldn't quite fit in. In DKC 1, they were closer to Yoshi, where your Kongs always rode on their back and you lost them upon getting hit, but when DKC 2 rolled around, that style of buddy was kept alongside these magical buddy barrels, which transformed your Kongs into the character themselves. This game continues the system introduced last time, and it features a mixture of Yoshi-style buddies alongside the transformation barrels. As in the previous game, I think this is the ideal approach to handling this iconic mechanic, since it makes the animal buddies come off as more integrated into the game itself, as it allows sections or even entire levels to be built around them and bring out their abilities better than the other approach. Also, not having to annoyingly chase them down just to have the chance to keep using them after getting hit is quite nice. In keeping with the trend the second game established, this game's roster of buddies carries over several familiar faces from previous entries, while also introducing a few new ones, and more unfortunately, axing others. For instance, Rattly is nowhere to be seen, which I think really sucks because he was one of my favorite buddies from DKC 2. His high jump was really useful, and in many cases led to some really enjoyable stages, so to see him go is just kind of a shame in my eyes. However, you all know the most significant change made in this regard, and that's of course the absence of Rambi, the series' most iconic animal buddy by far. In my opinion, that just doesn't feel right, since he was the first animal buddy you ever come across, quite literally introducing the concept of animal buddies itself to this series by appearing in the opening stage of the first game. He was also pretty useful too. I think that's the important part. I found him extremely fun to use in DKC 2 especially. And following the improvements the game made to how he controls, I felt he was the best he'd ever been. So the fact he was abandoned completely in the next game, not gonna lie, that's kind of disappointing. Usually though, whenever this series gets rid of an animal buddy, there's another that takes their place. Like with what happened with Winky and Rattly. So I bet you really want to hear about who replaced him. Well, hold that thought for a moment. While it does kind of blow that they removed some of the best buddies from the last few games, several of the top ones are still present. For instance, Squawks the Parrot comes back, and he's the same flying, egg-spitting powerhouse that DKC 2 upgraded him to, making it so he's still a blast to use whenever you get the chance. Unfortunately, in my experience, there's very few such chances, and instead, it seems like his lame purple cousin Quawks gets a way more time in the spotlight. So remember how the level Parrot Chute Panic had you descend with Quawks, and it was the only level in that game that featured him? That's because, let's not kid ourselves, Quawks is a really boring buddy that's not nearly as fun to use as Squawks. I mean, he's basically the same exact thing, but with a more stripped down moveset. I don't think I have to explain myself there. Rareware acknowledged this, so Quawks was limited to a single level and integrated as a clever set piece. In this game, however, he's converted into a full-fledged character you gain control of more than once. And like I said, it almost feels as though you have to play as him way more than the green egg-spitting bird you actually want to be. I don't know if that's just an illusion because of how ungodly long and slow Quawks' sections feel, or if they actually do make you play as him more frequently than Squawks, but either way, I don't get why they did this. Take a character who wasn't even a character to begin with, and was instead an intentionally limited version of another created for the sake of a single level, and then make you play as him in these extended puzzle sections where all you do is slowly and tediously grab barrels and drop them on enemies? Are you actually nuts? Quawks is plainly not fun to play as in my opinion, and I truly do not, for the life of me, understand why they're so fond of him in this game. Is it filler? I don't know, maybe, but bottom line is, I don't like that they did this, and would have greatly preferred if Squawks was used every time instead. But hey, at least Squitter the Spider's back again, as is Ungard the Swordfish. Squitter was one of the DKC 2's best buddies if you ask me, so I'm really glad he returns in DKC 3. He can once again shoot out webs with the leftmost face button, which act as bullets that take out enemies in one hit. This even applies to these huge, obnoxious, otherwise unkillable Kremlings called Cuff and Cloud. Jesus, his name is Cloud, the jokes write themselves. Regardless, eliminating these guys is beyond satisfying. Especially with that scream they make as they fall off the screen. Yeah, that's for being a pain in the ass, you ugly bastards. Oh shit, wait, I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit. As I was saying, Squitter also has his secondary ability once again, where pressing the rightmost face button allows you to shoot a slower web. However, this one isn't an attack, and instead, pressing the same button again while the web is still on screen turns it into a temporary platform. I find this ability really fun to use once again, especially in the sections designed around it. Sadly, for whatever reason, there's a lot fewer of these dedicated sections for Squitter, and a lot of the time he seems to be used as a mere power-up instead. That's the thing with a lot of this game's animal buddies, actually. I feel like a lot of the time they function more like DKC 1's power-up adjacent system. I know I brought up how there's still stages that transform you into the buddy and use them as a set piece in and of themselves, and yeah, this game has plenty of that stuff. That being said, I swear it feels as though a lot of animal buddy segments in this game take the Yoshi approach to to an imbalanced degree. At the very least, this game seems like it has more instances of the Yoshi approach than its predecessor, in addition to numerous levels that transform you, but aren't completely built around the buddy's abilities, as in the entire time you're playing as the buddy. Some may prefer this, and even I don't think it's a huge deal, but in all honesty, I kinda wish they had gone even crazier with the Animal Buddies dedicated sections, because in my opinion, they would have felt even more integral that way. In any event, Ungard once again returns as the Animal Buddy for the water stages, and is as powerful and fun to use as he's been since the beginning. I honestly think it's crazy that he's the only Animal Buddy to remain consistent across all 3 games, in terms of how he controls and what he's used for. Squawks was also technically in DKC1, but he was nothing like his more well-known incarnation in the sequels back then, instead only appearing in the level Torchlight Trouble as a supplemental source of light. Thankfully, this game finally ditches that kind of Animal Buddy, where they light up a dark area and violently flash you in the face whenever you would dare attempt to turn around. I thought the idea itself of lighting a dark area with them was fairly cool, but the potential seizures were just not worth it. So good riddance as far as I'm concerned. If a change means less people are physically prevented from enjoying a game, then I'm all for it. Anyway, Ungard the Swordfish. Ungard maintains the same exact movement physics he's had since the first game, making him the same incredibly useful tool for swimming sequences. And he additionally keeps the charge ability that the second game added to his moveset, so that's also cool. I don't really have anything new to say about him, because again, he's virtually unchanged from the rest of his appearances in the series, apart from how he seems to be tragically underutilized like Squitter. He appears in pretty much every water stage, but never in a hidden area or anything like that. For instance, in Baz's Blockade, you only get him from a bonus room that transforms you into him, so if you're not going for those, you can miss out on him entirely in that case. As with the other buddies, I wish he was more integrated, because he's still as awesome as ever. But anyway, you're most likely already aware of these buddies. I don't have a whole lot new to say about them, because in most cases they're the same as ever, as it feels like I've said nearly 100 times now, so I'll get to the point. As I've discussed this, there's a pretty big elephant in the room that I've intentionally been glossing over, literally, because that's who the new animal friend is. Ellie the elephant is this game's ace in the hole as far as animal buddies go, and she essentially acts as Rambi's replacement. As opposed to Rambi, who was centered around sheer strength in combat, Ellie is a more puzzle-oriented buddy that asks you to be more methodical in what you're doing whenever you're given control over her. Ellie's central mechanic is her trunk, and holding down the Y button causes her to inhale, which can have a number of effects. She can pull in and pick up any barrels with this ability, where subsequently releasing the button sends them rolling, or suck up water that can be shot out as a projectile. Except with limited ammo, you have to refill with a source of water. Oh, and she's also scared of sneaks, these rat enemies that are basically reskins of DKC2's Neeks, which themselves were essentially reskins of DKC1's Naughties. You know those beaver guys? Yeah, Ellie freaks out whenever she sees the successor to their successor. Confused yet? Good! Insert some comment about elephants being scared of mice in folklore or some shit. Honestly, I kinda like Ellie, and find that her abilities are simple yet effective for what they ask you to do. They can also make for some pretty fun and creative puzzles and bosses that I enjoy a fair bit. And what certainly helps matters is that she appears a fair few times, which allows her abilities to be properly fleshed out. That said, I do have some nitpicks to mention, namely with how Ellie can sometimes feel a little slow, which can conflict with the series' breakneck pacing. This aspect isn't as prevalent with her as it is with Quawks, but still noticeable. Although as I'll delve into soon, I don't think it's all her fault that things can feel slow sometimes. Additionally, these aforementioned moments where the sneaks scare her and she jumps into the air and runs away are really annoying in my opinion. Not only because you briefly have your control taken away, which just feels bad, but also because there may or may not be a certain hidden level that makes something really irritating out of it. Ah shit, sorry, I'm jumping the gun yet again. Hell, I even remember one instance in level Murky Mill, where I somehow managed to get stuck between 2 groups of sneaks, and was basically soft locked for a short bit. Not sure how that happened, but still, that shouldn't be possible whatsoever. Regardless of these things, I still enjoy using Ellie, and while I would have personally preferred it if Rambi returned, she has plenty of her own fun to offer. Oh yes, and this game also has one more new animal buddy, that being Perry the Parallel Bird. This guy, well, flies parallel to the plane the Kongs are walking on, and as he does, he can grab items that are too high to reach otherwise. Well, unless you use the team-up move, but I digress. Perry is closer in spirit to Squawks' appearance in DKC1, or Clapper and Glimmer from DKC2, in that he's a sort of utility buddy. By that, I mean he's not directly playable, and instead acts as support, grabbing items that are too high, as I said, and even rewarding you with an extra life if you can manage to bring him to the no animal sign near the end of the stage, without losing him to an enemy, such as a Buzz. A neat idea if you ask me, but one which may or may not really get in the way later on. That's really all I've got for the animal buddies. I enjoy using them as always. I just wish all of them were more consistently utilized and involved with the game rather than just some of them. Gee, I sure did nearly slip into discussing the level design there more than once, huh? Well, hold it there for a minute, cowboy. I'm not done here yet. For as great of a transition as that would have been, I still haven't discussed another one of this game's most notable changes to the DKC formula, how the world map works. Fundamentally, it's the same as the previous games, in the sense that the worlds and levels are laid out in the same way. For those familiar with data structures, it's kind of organized into a tree, where the root is the main world map, each of its children are the worlds, and their children are the game's various levels. In other words, you have this main overworld map where the icons are worlds with their own submap, in which each icon is a level or service. As I said, DKC3 follows this structure, but there's a catch. Specifically with how the main map screen is less rigid and straightforward. It's an expanse of open space where you're able to swim or take a boat rented from Funky around its waters to access worlds. Gone are the days of Funky's flights and the worlds being laid out in a linear sequence. You're now given the reins to explore the northern hemisphere and, in theory, pick and choose the order you want to do the worlds in. Additionally, you're freely able to exit a world whenever you want to by backtracking through its submap, and can pop in and out at your leisure. This sounds really enticing in concept, especially as someone who likes Mario World and Land 2 so much, and I can easily see it being a reason why someone would consider this their favorite in the trilogy. However, in my opinion, this system ultimately comes off as superfluous and wasted, because for whatever reason, they still lock certain worlds behind completing others. There is precisely one instance in the whole game where you're able to choose the order you want to do the worlds in, and that's the third and fourth worlds, Cotton Top Cove and Mechanos. Oh yeah, and a hidden world that may or may not exist, but we're not there yet. I will concede that's pretty cool, but in my opinion, it doesn't really matter because of how underused the idea is. I can understand preventing you from accessing the final world since, well, it's the final world, and I'm even fine with the worlds being divided into tiers, with things such as the jet ski being needed to go up waterfalls. But seriously, why can't I do Razor Ridge before K3 if I wanted to? Would it really be the end of the world if I wanted to play Kremwood Forest before Lake Orangatanga? I don't see the logic behind restricting the player in this way, because at that point you might as well just give the game a traditional world map. Some may respond by saying there's a solid amount of exploration, and sure, you got me there. However, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a whole lot to find, or at least I'd say so anyway. I mean, there's Brothers Bear cabins, banana birds, which can be found in these weird crystal caverns, more on those later, and maybe one more thing perhaps, but that's really it. This world map definitely supplies some exploration, but in my opinion, it's not meaningful exploration. If they had done something like hide places to earn extra lives around the place, then maybe I'd be more convinced, but as is, well, at least the system doesn't lead to any tangible downsides. With that mentioned though, what makes me graduate from tolerance to acceptance of this new system is how the save feature now works. This game also uses save points placed on the world map, specifically Wrinkly's Save Cave, as its method of recording your progress. Unlike the previous two games, however, there's one simple change that makes a world of difference. Alongside Funky's rentals on the main island near the game's starting area, they placed a save point, and since you're freely able to exit the world you're playing and return there, you're essentially allowed to save whenever you want. They finally did it. They moved past the previous game's dated method of saving, where you're only allowed to do so after reaching the world's save point, which can be placed at any random spot in its map, might I add, and allowed you to do it whenever you want. Granted, it's not the most convenient thing in the world, since leaving a submap can occasionally take a really long time, and you also have to drive your boat all the way back to the game's starting area, so I still would have preferred a pause menu you could bring up to save on demand, but I'll take what I can get. And hey, each world still has its own save point too, so once you reach it, you can just use that instead. Also, I like how you no longer have to pay to use the save points. This game does still have its own form of currency, this time a type of silver coin called bear coins, but these are only used for purchasing things from the Brothers Bear and playing matches of Swanky's Sideshow. Instead, saving is totally free, therefore allowing you to do it as much as you'd like, no exceptions. Personally, I've never really minded the paid saving in DKC2, and if it was still a thing in this game, I wouldn't have been too terribly upset, but a lot of people really don't like how you have to spend banana coins to save in the second game, and it's not like such a thing has any real benefits, so I can only see this as an improvement. For my money, these are huge steps up that greatly improve the game's accessibility for newer players, since they'll no longer have several minutes of progress arbitrarily erased just because they died a few too many times in a level that's giving them trouble. Or you could say, double trouble, am I right? Hey, I'll be here all week. Anywho, in an ideal world, this game wouldn't have lives in the first place, but that's a different discussion entirely, possibly for another day. I'm just really glad the save feature was finally improved, even if it's still not the most streamlined thing ever. Additionally, I quite like this game's boss fights, and I'd say they're about on par with its predecessor's offerings. Each boss still has distinctive phases with an emphasis placed on more in-depth attack patterns, but in this game they instead seem to prioritize a greater amount of puzzle elements in figuring out how to damage a boss, rather than just avoiding attacks with your raw skill with the game's movement. The first boss, Belcha, this gigantic barrel monster with bloodshot eyes, is pretty easy, since all you have to do is toss a few knickknacks into his mouth, which causes a burp to send him flying backwards. Once you do this enough and send him into the pit and the far right side of the barn, you win, which is not hard. He is the first boss though, so that makes sense, and he's still doing loads better than Very Naughty. The rest of the game's bosses are quite a bit better, and I find they can be quite fun and creative. My favorites include Arik, a massive spider you have to jump on and hit with barrels, during which he'll spit out green pellets you have to avoid. And Chaos, the game's main villain, yeah, for sure, totally, who attempts to damage the Kongs by burning them with his ass rocket, and then later shooting lasers at them. In between attack cycles, he'll briefly stop and saw blades will swing from his body, which you'll have to jump on to reach his head and deal damage of your own. Doing this can be a little finicky and annoying, since if you're not careful, he can knock you off with a boxing glove and potentially make you wait through another attack cycle, but in spite of that, I think this fight is a challenging yet fair boss. Bleak is also an extremely unique boss in general, and incorporates the gameplay from Swanky's Sideshow, which, now that I've mentioned that, I think is a huge downgrade from Swanky's Bonus Bonanza. I think you can earn lives from the Sideshow, but I've never seen it happen, and I don't find the gameplay on display any fun outside of Bleak's fight irrespective of that. Anyway, you'll have to toss snowballs at him, with each hit you land being followed by him blasting you with larger snowballs fired from his hat, and in my opinion, it's a really fun and inventive boss. I also find all the boss's designs really interesting, namely Squirt, who's this, well, whatever the hell he is. The only main fight I don't really care much for is Barbos, a massive lurchin. Yes, that's what they're called, lurchins, because he's a total crapshoot. Sometimes this fight behaves and offers a decent time, whereas others, the collision detection and enemy AI just seem to have it out for me and never want to work correctly. Certainly not helping matters is how damn long his 3 extensive phases drag out for, which ultimately leaves me with a bad taste in my mouth either way. Besides that though, this game has a solid roster of bosses if I do say so myself. But with that in mind, I'd say the camera has seen nothing but downgrades happen to it, and in my experience, it's by far the worst it's been in the series. Some people hate the camera in all 3 DKC games, and I'll admit, it was never perfect. I'd argue DKC 1 suffered from it more per capita, and that DKC 2 greatly improved it with more intelligent panning and enemy placement that was better designed around its limitations, and the 224x256 resolution of the system. But even that game could have the occasional visibility hiccup here and there. By contrast, here in DKC 3, it's not just occasional. No, in this game, it seems to get in the way all the damn time. It's not as much of a problem horizontally in most cases, although in my experience it's still far worse than the previous 2 games in this regard, which I'll get to, believe you me. But vertically, dear God, don't even get me started. At least the intelligent panning from the second game seems to have made its way when traveling to the left or right, which makes it somewhat possible to see what's coming, but vertically, it's nearly insufferable sometimes. Without a doubt, the place it's the worst is in the game's vertical auto-scrollers, because those were definitely something that needed to exist, which in my opinion become extremely frustrating because it's nigh impossible to see what the hell's above you due to the fact that the damn screen has a locked scrolling speed that the enemy placement doesn't even attempt to accommodate. It makes this game come off like it had some sort of development issue behind the scenes, as if the designers weren't as experienced as Rareware's A-team, or were under some kind of pressure to get the game done or something. I don't know for sure what exactly was going on, but whatever happened, this downgraded camera just makes the game come off as way more sloppy than its predecessors in my opinion. Which brings me to another element of this series I've been levying praise at throughout these videos, its level design. This is one of the main aspects that made Donkey Kong Country so special in my opinion, because it's a series that's always had such player-friendly design. Its main design goal was always to craft levels with an acquired flow, meaning you're able to go through the stages cleaner as you get better at the games. As a beginner, the stage's obstacles provide a challenge, whereas on later playthroughs you're able to instead focus on getting through each stage fast, while making as few mistakes as possible. In general, the hazard placement seems intentionally arranged to facilitate such a breakneck pace, in both how everything is aligned and the relative lack of fluff or padding. And I find it very fulfilling to play these games while running through each stage really quickly. In my eyes, DKC is such an improvement over the typical standard for the side-scrolling formula. And while it too can occasionally fall into genre trappings like auto-scrollers or enemy placement that wasn't perfectly thought out, I find that it usually eschews these tropes, and at the same time takes the genre's strongest aspects and makes them even stronger. DKC 2 was particularly strong in this respect for me, and I'd say it was the game to pretty much perfect the genre. Following such a high bar being set by that game, I'm almost certain expectations for the third game were soaring. I know if I were alive back then and was a fan of this series, that's what I would be thinking. So how do I think DKC 3 follows up on the level design of this second game? Well, as much as it pains me to say this, and as much as I wish I could give a clean answer, the level design is unfortunately kind of all over the place. And in general, I think it's about as much of a mixed bag as many other things in this game. Sometimes it's great, but other times, not so much. It has many levels that I love, which feel right at home in quality with the first 2 games, but by that same token, it also has many that I either take significant issue with or dislike entirely. I don't know what exactly happened, but for whatever reason, this game can switch from being an absolute blast into a frustrating chore at a moment's notice, and it comes off as really inconsistent and sloppy to me. Put simply, this game has some of my favorite stages in the series, but also some that suck a load of Gorilla Ball. At the very least, regardless of whether any given stage falls into either of these 2 categories, I can appreciate their their efforts to prevent the game from becoming stale. Much like DKC2, each of this game's levels at least tries to do something new in an attempt to keep things fresh. And even if some of the stages have similar settings and ideas, they all try to have variations that stop the game from getting old and repetitive. Whether or not these set pieces land is another matter entirely, but I appreciate what they try to do on principle. I can call DKC3 a lot of things, but the one word I can't use is boring. Well, mostly, and I think that's worth a lot. At its very best, I think this game could be a genuine blast, and as I said, it has some of the greatest level design in the trilogy. Even from the very start, this game shows a glowing amount of promise, and I can easily see someone thinking the heights of this game's levels outdo even some of the top ones from the previous games. Its best stages successfully use creative set pieces to change up how you platform, and as in DKC2, this isn't always just left to right. Certain levels progress vertically, and others do something more complex, usually by combining horizontal and vertical segments with whatever idea the stage is playing around with or using a zigzag structure. Generally speaking, DKC3 also seems to follow that design pattern I talked about last time. If you need a refresher, then basically every level starts off by simply introducing its concept in a safe area, which allows you to get acclimated to it. As the level goes on, they play around with it, mixing and matching the idea in more tricky scenarios with a greater amount of hazards and enemies. By the end, they go absolutely nuts with it, and play around with a set piece one last time before the curtain closes, providing a test of the skill you've accumulated throughout the stage. I've said it before, but this is what I'd call the ideal level structure for a linear obstacle course platformer such as this. It's a very logical way to go about designing a challenge that's memorable, complete, and nuanced, resulting in a level that's extremely fun and replayable. Like I said, this game's levels employ this structure to not infrequently fantastic effect in their own right, and whenever it's successful, it really is. A lot of the time, these levels also keep the quick pacing that makes this series so fun to come back to, so that's great as well. Starting out, the first world, Lake Orangatanga, is decent, but by the time you reach the second world, Kremwood Forest, it really starts picking up. For instance, we've got Barrel Shield Bust Up, where a bunch of monkeys toss nuts at you, and you need to hide behind these shields and time your passes while climbing the ropes to avoid taking a hit from them. Riverside Race, in which you run through a riverbank, avoiding this immortal swarm of flies and popping in and out of the water as quickly as possible. Spring and Spiders, which has you hop on spiders who jump really high and act as platforms themselves. And Bobbing Barrel Brawl, where you take control of Ellie and use her abilities to cross piranha-infested waters, specifically by picking up barrels and setting them up as platforms on the water. Hell, for as crazy as I might sound, I don't even mind Squeals on Wheels that much, even though it can be kinda slow. I find tossing the barrels at the sneaks surprisingly fun and satisfying to do, and this end set piece where you fall through all these trapdoors is cool, alright? That's only the second world, however, and the game has numerous other stages that I get my jollies from. For example, Rocket Barrel Ride and Trekker Barrel Trek, two waterfall stages that feature spins on a similar mechanic, are both really fun in my experience. At their base level, both stages involve a special type of barrel cannon, specifically one which moves in some way before launching you. However, the difference comes in which direction they move. In the former, the barrels travel upwards like a, well, rocket, and you have to direct your Kongs by using the D-pad after getting launched at the top of the barrel. Usually, this also involves buzzes, who are strategically placed around to form an obstacle course. To be honest, that's what I've noticed a lot of this game's stages entail, dodging enemies, namely buzzes. Sure, there's a lot of pits as well, and other deadly hazards, but from what I can tell, this game is the one that's most centered around this type of design. And that's saying a lot because DKC1 and especially DKC2 were filled to the brim with zingers. I don't think that's good, nor bad, it's just kind of a neutral fact inherently. Anyway, as I was saying, Rocket Barrel Ride has these buzzes placed in between barrels, meaning you'll have to move to the next one at the right time to avoid taking a hit. It's a pretty fun set piece, and a sweet shake-up from the typical type of barrel blast level. Likewise, Trekker Barrel Trek is also a barrel cannon stage, but instead of the barrels traveling upwards when you jump into them, they move sideways and you'll have to direct them yourself. Roughly every second, they'll also launch your Kongs upwards, which you'll have to take into account when maneuvering the barrels around, since there's often plenty of enemies waiting for you, namely buzzes again. At one point, you also take control of Ellie, and can grab some ammunition from the waterfall to take out any buzzies that stand in your way. All in all, these levels are two of my most beloved in the game, because they're honestly just really fun. I've always liked the barrel blast levels in this series, and these may just be some of the best in that regard because of how inventive they are with the idea. Another category of levels that I can't get enough of is the factories, which I would say are consistently some of the game's finest works. There's just no beating the top of the line set pieces and fast pacing that these levels have in store. The first one you encounter, Fireball Frenzy, is this really sick challenge where you have to dodge fireballs shot at you by these owls in the background, who are using oversized bazookas to do said shooting. They play around with this concept in some genuinely enjoyable ways, including the time you have to avoid these guys' attacks while standing on an ascending elevator, or when they ask you to weave between their fireballs while on a horizontal rope suspended over a vat of molten iron. Near the end of the level, they also pull one of those moments where they go crazy with the concept, and you'll have to run past several lines of these guys quickly firing on you, even needing to traverse that area in the opposite direction on a higher rope, before one last mad dash with with 5 more of them alternating, requiring you to carefully thread the needle once again to get by. I find this extremely fun, tense, and cathartic, and in general, it's definitely one of the game's most expertly designed levels. Blazing Bazookas then comes later in the same world, and it naturally makes use of bazookas, that small Kremlin with the oversized bazooka. Jesus Christ, how many times have I said bazooka in this pair? This level sees you using the barrels they shoot out of their handheld blasters as platforms, in much the same way as Mudhole Marsh with its cannon enemies, and timing barrel shots to land on ropes or the ground such that you avoid getting hit by TNT barrels. At one point, you even get to play as Squitter, as he uses his web platforms to evade the bazooka's attacks in much the same way. A really fun time all around. However, my favorite stage in the game is probably Crackshot Croc, a level from K3. In this one, you play as Squitter and are constantly pursued by Croc, a Kremlin aiming at you from off-screen that only appears as a reticle. Periodically, he locks onto you at your current position and launches a fireball, at which point you'll need to move out of the way or risk damage. This level is an intense affair that consistently keeps you on your toes throughout its whole runtime, and I just can't get enough of it. It's classic DKC platforming at its finest, providing a breakneck pace that gels extraordinarily well with the constant escalation and challenge and inventive ideas. It gets an all-around gold star for me. Also, hilariously enough, even though Croc is an enemy, he's internally considered an animal buddy by the game's code, which I find really funny. Oh, the days of only having 128 kilobytes of main memory to use, huh? Anywho, after all of that, you may think I'd find it hard to offer any more praise, but no, there's several more examples that I can point out. Fish Food Frenzy has you feeding a ravenous piranha called Nibla, who constantly swims behind you demanding you give him his fill. Feed me! Yeah, shut up, you bastard. Which, 2 for 2, he's also an entity the game internally considers an animal buddy. Don't let that fool you, however, since if this guy doesn't eat, he'll gradually turn red until he takes one of your Kongs out. Well, that's not very nice. The only way to appease him is to feed him cocos, these red and green clownfish, and avoid lurchins, since those prickly bastards only piss him off even more. Conveyor Rope Clash centers around moving ropes, which are swarmed with buzzes. Naturally, making it through the stage in one piece requires bobbing and weaving through them, timing your jumps and drops off the ropes such that you pass through unharmed. Poisonous Pipeline is probably my favorite pipeline level in the game, and by far the most creative water stage in the series, to be honest. It features purple water that flips your horizontal controls, so holding left makes you go right and vice versa. Oh, and guess what else is purple and flips your controls? Captain K. Rool's Magic Blast from the previous game. How's that for attention to detail? All of these levels are, again, fun for me, and are actually stages I was once iffy on that grew on me over a few playthroughs. Finally, another especially cool level is Lightning Lookout, which has a simple yet effective set piece, a lightning storm you have to avoid. Honestly, this storm has some fairly solid AI, for lack of a better term, because at first it strikes where you currently are, but later on, the lightning leads its shots, so to speak, tracking your position and then striking at the exact spot you'll end up with your current movement speed. To avoid these strikes, you'll have to fake the lightning bolt out by running in the opposite direction when the signifier, which is a small flash of lightning, appears above the area it's about to hit. This level is just awesome, that's all I can really say. I find it so much damn fun to outrun and dodge this storm, and these parts where you have to quickly swim through and jump on barrels floating in water to avoid being shocked are some of my favorite sections of the stage. All around, it's great. As a whole, this game can be really fun when at its best, and can offer a solid challenge that stays interesting without becoming overwhelming. With all that said, even though I just gave out a shit ton of praise for this game's level design, that's not the full story. Remember how I mentioned that whereas I love a lot of DKC3's levels, I also take major issue with another significant portion of them? Well, get ready for some real tonal whiplash, because yeah, I wasn't joking. Consistent is the last word I would use to describe the overall level design in this game. Because while many are levels I like a lot, there's an equal amount I don't like a lot, if not outright despise. Let me tell you, I've got a bone to pick with some of these goddamn levels, and at some point in the game, it really starts to fall off in my opinion. Initially, things seem totally fine, and for the first 2 or 3 worlds, this game seems like it's going to be yet another unambiguously great title with next to no design issues to speak of, very similarly to its predecessors. Lake Orangatanga, Kremwood Forest, and Cotton Top Cove are all full of good to great levels, with some particularly excellent ones equaling if not surpassing some of the offerings from even the illustrious second game. However, the minute you reach Mechanos, which is either the 3rd or 4th world depending on the order you play them in, although personally I canonically consider it to be the 4th world, is where the issues start manifesting, giving the ominous feeling something's not right. Almost like things are about to become a lot rockier and muddier moving forwards. Not right away, as you're immediately treated to Fireball Frenzy, one of the game's best levels, but after that, you reach it. Demolition Drain Pipe, the game's first toboggan level, which is the stand-in for the minecart and roller coaster levels from before. Sounds like fun, does it not? There's only one problem. This level sucks. It sucks really, really bad. At least in my opinion it does. It's the watershed moment where the game starts going downhill. I don't even know where to begin since I feel practically everything about it blows, so why not do a quick fire round? You're traveling forward way too quickly, the camera's complete and utter fucking garbage, the enemy placement is not conducive to these things one bit, and features frequently obnoxious blind seds, and sections of plain and pure frustration. The toboggan handles like shit anyway and is a huge target, which only exacerbates this. They felt the need to put this stupid rail on top of the stage that only gets in the way. Sometimes you'll get hit by something even though you swear you made it over fair and square. It's a mess. I can't stand playing this level, and in my opinion, it's absolutely insufferable to play. What sucks so much is that I find the vehicle levels in the previous games to be so enjoyable, so I have no idea what went wrong here to make this game's incarnation of the concept so miserable to engage with. Whenever they have one of these levels, I always groan, because I know I'm in for several more minutes of annoying nonsense that doesn't provide me an ounce of fun. But perhaps you think I'm being too harsh, and you know what, maybe I am. It is only one type of level after all, so why did I harp on it so much when its kin takes up a mere 5% of the game's stages? Well, to be honest, it's because I think the toboggan levels are a microcosm, representing my larger issues with the worst of this game's level design. It seems, to me anyway, that 4 worlds in, the designer's idea of difficulty shifted from genuine challenge that puts your skills to a proper test, a design philosophy the series had perfected by this point, to an occasionally annoying level with set pieces tossed in there just because, without the proper care placed into balancing it out, almost as if they weren't finished and just plopped into the game anyway. Of course, you may not feel that way, the shit is all subjective of course, but in my experience, I consistently find myself getting enraged at some of these late game levels, because I feel their design is fairly unrefined periodically. Especially once you reach K3 and Razor Ridge, this effect becomes apparent, and in my opinion, the level design becomes extremely mixed in quality. Really, my issues can be boiled down to a few simple things that nonetheless tick me off. First off, the game's camera, which I've gone into already. I think DKC3 has the worst case of screen crunch in the series by far. The previous 2 games could suffer from this on occasion, but here I'd say the camera constantly gets in the way. Contributing to this issue is, of course, the enemy and hazard placement, which I feel is often poorly thought out and leads to many ambushes, especially in vertical segments. This is all stuff I've already gone over, again, so I don't feel the need to repeat myself in too much detail, although I should note that they bother me, considering how these aspects were more or less fine in this game's predecessors, but are inexplicably worse here. In addition to these things, sometimes there will be a level that, if you ask me anyway, features a gimmick that clashes with them, or is otherwise just not that fun. For instance, I already brought up the toboggan levels and all the reasons I hate them, but then you have confused cliffs, which is one of the most unenjoyable platforming levels I have ever played. Or at least from the games I've played. I admittedly haven't played as many as some other people. Man, I have to change that. Regardless, the reasons why confused cliffs blows can be boiled down to 2 words. Vertical auto-scrolling. You're on a rope, which has a fire at the bottom. Oh shit, we gotta get up in that damn rope as fast as possible. However, you can't do that, and instead you have to wait as the screen slowly scrolls upwards. I think it's really slow, dull, and boring. Completely antithetical to the mission statement of this series at the very least. However, that just wasn't enough, and they had to throw in some obnoxious enemy placement as well. Seriously, do you see this? Is it even possible to avoid these copters and buzzes if you don't already know they're coming? As an experienced player, this can be annoying, but as a newcomer, it's hell. It means you'll likely be dying a lot, and that of course means playing this slow, tedious stage for longer than necessary. I mean shit, why on earth is this level an auto-scroller anyway? What was the logic there? This isn't a new concept for the series. You know, something at the bottom of the screen you have to run away from as it slowly rises towards you, and in all previous examples of such a thing, you've been able to go at your own pace and outrun it entirely. For me, that was so much more fun, because you didn't have to slowly wait as the screen limited you from moving forward. Anytime there was auto-scrolling in the first 2 games, I'd say it was way more fun anyway though, because at least the hazards there were engaging to dodge. This is just plain awful no matter how I slice it, because as I said, it's a bunch of frustrating shit flying onto the screen and limiting you to such a small portion of it, meaning memorization is the only way to succeed in this level, or it's just the main way too. I don't see why they couldn't make it so you could outrun the burning rope at your own pace. Sure, there would still be the issue of the enemies dive bombing in from above, but I think that would have improved the level tenfold on its own at least. Then you could just tweak the layout to involve horizontal burning ropes, or jumping between them, essentially something more akin to chain link chamber, and I think they would have been golden, because I like the idea of a burning rope itself. However, the execution is where I take issue, and to me it comes off as though this level was slapped together with very little care. In a similar vein, Ripsaw Rage suffers from this same problem, as another vertical auto-scroller that locks the hazard on screen. What's weird is that this level is pretty much just Toxic Tower but reskinned, except for the fact that, like Confused Cliffs, you can't move up this tree at your own pace, or any faster than the screen scrolls for that matter. In general, these levels where DKC3 forces you to go along at its pace rather than your own are the absolute worst parts of this game, and in my opinion, it's at odds with what made the series so compelling in the first place. It's also flipping awful at it, so there's that too. In my experience, that, combined with the poor vertical visibility and how damn strict the stupid saw forces you to be with your movement to avoid taking damage, makes it so this level for sure lives up to its moniker. Actually, come to think of it, that's an issue that a large portion of this game suffers from, as far as I see it anyway. It, more so than any other DKC game so far, is so particular with how you have to time your jumps and movement, where one wrong move will oftentimes lead to instant death or damage. Those god-awful toboggan levels once again come to mind, as well as some other particular examples I'll get to soon. Sometimes this game expects pitch-perfect reaction time to avoid danger, and if you don't have a CRT or other low latency display like I thankfully have, then this game can be a real bitch nightmare to play sometimes. Hell, it gets on my nerves sometimes when playing with a good setup, so I can only imagine how irritating it must be for people who are less knowledgeable about this technical stuff than weirdos like me, who are stuck with flat screen input delay or something. In fact, I know what that feels like, because again, my first playthrough was on one of those shitty TVs, and dude, the game was genuinely unplayable sometimes on that thing. I'm shocked I managed to make it as far as I did. In my opinion, formulating something so heavily around the timings of a CRT is dated design, because unless you're like me, why would you still own one of those things? Oh, and if you want to talk about dated, just take a look at the frame rate here in barrel drop bounce. Yeah, that looks fun to deal with, doesn't it? No idea why this level performs like that, by the way, it's just how it is and we have to accept it. I don't want to say all this shit makes DKC 3 the hardest game in the trilogy, because everything considered, it's honestly not. A lot of the stuff I've complained about doesn't necessarily make the game harder, and by this point I can get through basically all the game's levels without dying too many times. Minus those atrocious toboggan levels. Have I mentioned how much I can't stand them? My beef is, it makes the game come off as far less refined than what came before, as well as just generally not as fun after a point. These periodic dips in quality greatly affect the pacing for me, slowing the game to a crawl when they come up, which makes me believe this is an overall lesser game, especially after the excellent consistency and pacing these games established. I don't want this whole thing to just be a series of comparisons between this game and its predecessors, but since DKC 3 is a game in the same series as them that shares the exact same core gameplay, I think it's fair game to criticize when I feel it's not executed nearly as well as them. I'm not saying every game in this franchise has to be better than or exactly on par with DKC 2 to be good, because that would be an incredibly unfair standard. But in my opinion, this game is way less refined than even DKC 1 in the level design department, and yet it came out 2 years later. In my opinion, it features piss-poor execution of several good to great stage concepts at completely random intervals, making it so this game, for me anyway, can be summarized as bursts of brilliance surrounded by mounds of crap. While the brilliance occurs more often overall, those piles of shit are really, really tall. And smelly. Is it unfair for me to be a little disappointed by that after the series proved itself as a consistent provider of platforming excellence? Perhaps, and if you disagree with every last word I've said, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. As always, these videos are my own subjective thoughts on a game, not some objective fact you're required by law to agree with. And in the event you do disagree, I'd encourage you to try your hand at making your own video about the game. With that said, though, I personally find this game to be disappointing following what came before. That doesn't mean I think this game sucks or anything like that, because that's not true at all. I just mean that I have significantly more issues with this game than the others, which makes me consider it the weakest one overall. The level design and pacing were some of the core aspects that made the previous game so great in my opinion. So to have the third game in the exact same trilogy turn in such an inconsistent batch of levels, I mean, this game's level design isn't bad, as I've discussed, at least not fully, but it's so wildly all over the place that it makes the game come off as really schizophrenic and rushed to me. It's the furthest thing from consistent in my opinion. Sometimes it's fun, others it's boring, and occasionally it can even be frustrating and obnoxious. And in my eyes, that's just such a colossal shame, because I'd say this game had the potential to be one of the best platformers ever made. Weirdly enough, I've even noticed how the stage layouts can sometimes feel strangely haphazard, with weird break-off paths and empty space, which gives me the sinking suspicion that these levels weren't the most well thought out. Generally, writing about this game's level design has pretty much just left me frustrated and tired, because, again, this game is all over the damn place, and I feel like I'm losing my mind talking about this complicated beast of a game. What certainly doesn't help is the live system, which, in my opinion, is one last dick punch, simply because they're so much more sparse this time around, or at least more so than DKC 2. This game does still have hidden extra lives, about as many as the first two games actually, but for a reason that, to this day, I still do not understand. They completely removed the High Striker minigame that appeared at the end of DKC 2's levels, which was the primary source of lives in that game. All you had to do was jump on the target with the correct timing, and you'd basically be guaranteed an extra life every time, which I absolutely loved because it made the game way less stressful to play, for me anyway. In this game, however, there's no such thing, and the end goal of each stage is a simple flagpole that contains no item reward. rewards. That may not seem too significant, but this singular change makes lives so much less abundant, to an almost absurd degree. On top of that, like I mentioned in passing, Swanky's bonus bonanza was replaced by the far inferior Swanky's sideshow, thereby tanking another effective source of extra lives in a 1-2 punch. And I just have to wonder why. I understand they want to try new things, but why does that necessitate getting rid of all the most effective methods of earning extra lives? It means that should you encounter a dumbass level like Kong-fused cliffs that makes you piss away your limited supply of lives, you might be shit out of luck and have to do each stage on a low amount of lives, which I find plainly not fun and unnecessarily stressful. Also, the idea of having to restart some of these levels from square one just from dying too many times, no thank you. Thankfully, there's an easy way to get lives on demand in the first level, as using a team up move to reach the top of these stilts will treat you to 2 free life balloons. Therefore, if you're willing to, you can keep grinding your life count all the way up to the maximum, exiting and re-entering the level repeatedly to keep grabbing these balloons. I just bit the bullet and spent a whole 9 minutes doing this, also I could enjoy the game a whole lot more. And you know what? Even if a level is annoying, I find it a whole shit ton more tolerable when I have a high life count. For the obvious reason that a large amount of lives means you can keep attempting the stage without needing to restart after dying an arbitrary number of times. To some, that may be cheap, but for me, it's simply a matter of pacing, even if you're essentially free to save the game whenever you'd like. Also, there's absolutely no way I was using save states, because I consider that cheating. As I mentioned earlier, lives are an outdated mechanic that should have been abandoned decades ago in my opinion. So if there's a chance to max out your life counter, I'm pretty much always going to take it, within reason of course. I just wish there was a slightly more convenient way to grind for them like there was in DKC 1, but this wasn't intended anyway, so I'll shut my mouth about this topic. What I'm not going to shut my mouth about, however, is DKC 3's take on another iconic series staple, the side content, and more specifically the bonus rooms. To briefly recap, I've had generally positive feelings towards this aspect of the Donkey Kong Country series. The first game was a little unrefined in this regard, often having obscure bonus rooms, as well as a rather underwhelming reward for finding them all. So the second game looked at that and decided to expand on the concept with flying colors. It made most bonus rooms accessible from a distinct barrel, making them much less of a pain to find, while repurposing them as minigames of sorts that netted you a Krem coin upon completion. Those Krem coins gave you access to a bonus level belonging to the Kremling Lost World, one for each world, which eventually culminated in a secret final boss against K. Rool that results in Crocodile Isle collapsing and sinking into the ocean. Oh yeah, and each level had a specific DK coin, of which there were 40 total. Personally, I still prefer doing an any percent playthrough of DKC2 because it's what I'm more familiar with, and find slightly more replayable from a pacing perspective, but I still greatly appreciate the game's side quests, since, man, they're just so damn cool, and I feel they don't really disrupt the pacing too much. So how exactly does Dixie Kong's Double Trouble cap this aspect of the trilogy off? Well, as a start, this game carries over the base level improvements that Diddy's Conquest made, including the more distinct bonus barrels and fleshed out minigames. Alongside those from DKC2, this game adds a new type, where you have to collect 15 green bananas that randomly spawn in one of the few set locations in the time limit. So that's cool. At first, I find these things extremely enjoyable to go after, and for the initial few worlds, this game has bonus locations on par in quality with the second game. Those early stages have some genuinely clever placements, which I feel facilitate and encourage exploration in a good way. In addition to that, if you screw up one of these bonus rooms and miss out on the bonus coin, the replacement for Krem coins in this game, many of these early ones spawn you in a convenient location, thereby making it easy and painless to jump right back into the room and try again, much like the best of DKC2's bonus rooms. It's not totally free of the occasional inconvenient bonus room, but neither was DKC2, so I'd say it gets a pass in that regard. For now. In addition, the DK coins, which are actually officially referred to as such now, also make a return, and are once again hidden around somewhere in each stage. However, there's a catch, because rather than just being out in the open like last time, each one is now held by a special Kremling named coin. Very clever. To get the DK coin, you have to find a steel barrel, which yeah, those actually return from DKC1 by the way, how strange and random, and toss it in such a way that it thwacks coin in the back, thus defeating him and netting you the DK coin. This isn't always a gimme, since coin always points his shield at you, which blocks the barrel. So the challenge is, again, figuring out the right place to toss the barrel from, such that it takes him out. Sometimes this involves throwing the barrel and running it to the correct place, or throwing it at him while using his shield as a platform, or simply making a throw above his head. I will admit, while making every single DK coin only obtainable from coins can get mildly repetitive, I don't mind its inclusion. It's really only one extra step, which I feel doesn't get in the way. Mostly. Goddamn, take a shot every time I said the word coin in this paragraph, I mean, geesh. Actually, don't do that, please, I don't want to get sued. Anyway, it seems as though things are looking up for this game's full completion playthrough, and like it's going to be a great time in its own right. There's even a few extra things added for you to get occupied with, so surely getting that percentage of 103 is worth it, right? Well, I wish I could say that, but unfortunately these side quests make up what I consider the absolute worst full completion playthrough in the trilogy. To be frank, I have very little positive to say about these side quests outside of what I've said already, as well as the rewards you get for doing them. In my opinion, doing them is just not fun, and most certainly not worth it, since it just makes the game outright miserable in my experience. So with that band-aid ripped off, what exactly makes me not like going for 103% in this game? As I said, things don't start off too bad. Yeah, that's how this game gets you. At first, it seems like the side quests are going to be fulfilling in their own right, but as you play on, they gradually get more obnoxious and tedious. For one, the bonus rooms seemingly just forget about the convenience they had going for them in the early game, and many of them start spitting you out at the most inconvenient spots fucking possible, or otherwise make it a pain in the ass to re-enter them in some way. This makes it so that if you ever screw up and lose a bonus minigame, a very likely occurrence because they inexplicably decided to make these minigames disproportionately more difficult than they were before, then there's a high chance you'll have to take an intentional death to get in and try again. There's almost nothing more obnoxious, in my opinion anyway, than trying to finish a bonus minigame you've already fucked up multiple times, and then losing and having to sacrifice another life, which necessarily entails playing a section of the stage all over again just to make another attempt at the stupid goddamn bonus room. And let me tell you, they got carried away with some of these bonus rooms and their placements. Oftentimes, you'll have to keep both callings alive through a really annoying section of level design, potentially with blind sides that may not be entirely your fault, as I already discussed, since bonus rooms can straight up be too high in the air to reach otherwise. Sure, DKC2 had some instances of this specific annoyance as well, and I didn't even like it there, but here I'd say it's worse because it seems to happen much more frequently. On top of that, some rooms essentially force you to damage boost through a line of enemies, since they're moving in the direction opposite the one leading into the bonus room's area, with a speed and pattern that make them nigh unavoidable, which is occasionally paired with another obnoxious enemy blocking you from entering the barrel. The auto-scrolling levels, or really any stages that force you along like the toboggans, definitely have it the worst in my opinion, because their bonus rooms often require you to play near perfectly to enter. If you can't get into the bonus room in the minuscule amount of time provided for you to react, then tough luck, kid. Now you have to either lose a life or finish the stage, and play a significant section, or possibly even the entirety, of these infuriatingly slow and tedious levels just to get another shot at getting into the bonus room you're probably going to miss again anyway. Oh, and if you actually manage to get into one, do not lose it. Otherwise, you're doing all that again. Have a problem with that? Quit your whining. This is the only way we could have done this. Are you starting to see what I'm getting at now? I find that going after these bonus rooms is often a painstaking process, all because there's frequent instances where it seems like the people making these decisions tried to make it as inconvenient and therefore pace-breaking as possible. That's why I think it's so annoying that a majority of the bonus rooms in this game are tough enough to seemingly require multiple tries to complete. Actually, no, let me rephrase that. They're not necessarily tough, but rather it's so extraordinarily easy to make a mistake and get kicked out that it's not even funny. In and of itself, this isn't a bad thing, because even I'll admit that DKC2 could have some irritating bonus rooms from time to time. Additionally, like previously mentioned, this game does have some merciful rooms which actually do plop you in a reasonable spot in the event you fail a bonus challenge. It's just that, a lot of the time, where they put these inconvenient rooms is the absolute worst places they could have. Again, there's nothing more frustrating than needing to play a long section of a stage again, and repeat some incredibly infuriating method of accessing a room, since this toxic combination is enough to slow the pace of the game down to a crawl, therefore making me way less tolerant of this shit. It's especially awful to deal with when the bonus room itself is fucking impossible, figuratively speaking of course, because it only makes the process drag on for even longer. That right there is the crux of the issue for me, the pacing. In those instances where you can easily jump right back into a bonus room after failing, I'm willing to tolerate having to retry a couple of times, because it doesn't significantly stunt the pace of this otherwise quick platformer, periodic pacing issues I brought up aside. However, those types of bonus rooms seemingly become few and far between as the game marches on, which for me outright murders its pacing, because instead of being able to move on and do something new and fun, you'll be stuck for like 10 goddamn minutes rotting in one stupid bonus minigame that's ridiculously annoying to get into, let alone clear for how rigged it can feel, and I just can't stand it. Oh, but that's not even the worst of it, because there's one more fun little thing I haven't yet discussed. Remember Perry the Parallel Bird, and how bringing him to the no animal sign in a stage can give you special rewards? Well, someone on the development team had the bright idea to tie bonus rooms to the stupid parakeet bastard, meaning you'll have only one attempt to clear the room, or else you'll have to redo half the stage, or in one case, the whole damn level, all the while dragging his sorry ass through the entire thing again. This right here is the unholy grail of what I was talking about. Can you imagine trying to achieve full completion in a game, and then once you make it past one of the most frustrating challenges within, even managing to keep the stupid NPC you need alive, you end up failing their bonus challenge, which forces you to play that entire infuriating section all over again just to have another shot? Yeah, that scenario is a reality here in DKC3. Thankfully, this is extremely uncommon, only happening twice, but still, that's horrendous don't you think? At least, I think it is. If I can say anything positive after all that, I'm glad the amount of bonus rooms per stage is now more consistent, featuring a distribution of 2 bonuses per stage, at least in a super majority of cases. Also, you're still able to immediately leave a stage after grabbing something you may have missed, so that's appreciated as well. Other than those bright spots, however, going after the bonus rooms is mostly miserable experience for me, and I don't enjoy doing it. Those aforementioned coin puzzles are a little better if you ask me, but still not free of their own issues. I already mentioned how I would have liked it if there was a little more variety in their puzzles, since every one of them is quite literally taking this Kremling out with a steel barrel. For instance, it would be cool if there were still a few DK coins just hidden really well somewhere, or if they had thought of another type of puzzle, whatever that could have been. On the whole, these puzzles can be decently clever on their own, although usually I just find them alright and not that exciting. But like with the bonus rooms, there's those ones that can be an absolute pain in the ass. It's less frequent, only encompassing about 10% of the coins in the game or so, except that's probably a highball estimate. But when these puzzles get obnoxious, they really do. In particular, Creepy Caverns has one that I swear to God requires being almost frame perfect with your movements, it feels like. Like seriously, what the hell am I doing wrong here? Apparently, nothing. You just have to be goddamn exact with every last movement, that's all. Oh, and fuck these ones that only give you a single attempt by tying the steel barrel to an animal buddy, because, again, missing the throw means you'll have to play a sizable portion of the level all over again. I don't want to make it seem like I hate the inclusion of coin, because that's not true. However, if you were to ask me what I think of these puzzles while in the heat of the moment, as I was banging my head against a wall trying to complete one of the more frustrating puzzles, perhaps I would give you a different answer. As is, these puzzles were a neat experiment, one which succeeded sometimes but failed others, but that's all I can really say about them. Oh, guess what though? Those still aren't all the collectibles in this game, and there's actually a ternary one, that being these pesky banana birds I mentioned. A long time ago. There's 15 of these in the game, and they're collected in 2 primary ways. By completing these Simon Says minigames in the Crystal Grottos, which are hidden caves accessible on the world map, or by carrying out trading sequences with the Brothers Bear. Often this involves spending bear coins to acquire items from the brothers, such as the mirror from Bazaar's general store, which are used to satisfy requests and needs that the other bears have. For example, after getting a bowling ball from Blue, which was a present from Blizzard that he didn't have a use for, you can head over to Bazooka, who then launches you out of his cannon named Big Betty with it, allowing you to reach a crystal grotto hidden on this bizarre floating island, netting a banana bird. One even involves clearing Riverside Race in under a minute and 15 seconds, which is the instance I mentioned where Brash gets all butthurt from losing his record. This can be a bit annoying because in my experience, getting out of the water quickly is a task in itself for whatever reason, but I like the idea, and the checkpoint burial saves your time, so I'm willing to tolerate it. To be honest, this is a charming idea for a side quest, and the Brothers Bear tend to have really entertaining personalities, as I'm pretty sure I've delved into. I don't know, I'm losing my mind right now. This video is way too fucking long. Please send help. I need help. I need sleep. Help. I also like the design of the banana birds. Their fugly promotional renders notwithstanding. However, I personally think this side quest feels kinda tacked on, as if it was put in to pad out the full completion quest just that little bit more. The primary factor that contributes to this is the Crystal Grottos, which, I mean, it's a boring Simon Says minigame. A randomly decided pattern of button inputs flashes on the crystals, and you have to repeat it to get the banana bird. To me, this just comes off as filler, especially with how they make the later sequences so damn long. At that point, I just decided to start writing the patterns down because it was faster that way. Overall, I don't mind the idea of this extra side quest, but its execution leaves me disappointed. However, that's still not it, because DKC3 has its own version of a prominent element of DKC2's side content. I've basically made it no secret, but collecting bonus coins allows you to access a bonus level in a secret world called Krakatoa. The world's name is an obvious parody of Krakatoa, and from that piece of information, it's easy to infer that this world takes place inside a volcano.
Did someone
No, stop! We're not doing this again. You unlock this world by boating clockwise 4 times around these rocks, which causes the volcano to rise out of the water. Inside this world is Boomer, a member of the Brothers Bear who runs a demolition operation. Not sure how he was living here without drowning while the place was hidden beneath the waves, but whatever. Paying him 15 bonus coins will have him unlock one of the levels for you, which are by far the game's toughest challenges. Finishing one of them nets you a golden cog, which Boomer will place on this strange mystery machine in his cabin. All in all, I'm glad this game continues to provide bonus content as a reward for seeking out its side quests, but I have to be honest, I don't really care for Krakatoa, and I think it's a massive downgrade from DKC2's Lost World. Again, I don't want to make it seem like I hate this game, but when I don't like something, I'm gonna point it out, and Krakatoa falls into that category. If you thought the main game's levels were annoying sometimes, which I'd say they absolutely could be, then Krakatoa's are even worse. and way more consistently so at that. I know this world is supposed to be hard, but in my opinion, these levels are more so really annoying and padded rather than challenging. And honestly, it's not necessarily because of the levels themselves. Oh sure, some stages can be frustrating, namely Stampede Sprint, where you play as Ellie running at breakneck speeds after she's scared by a couple sneaks, which clashes with the camera and requires a low latency display to be remotely playable anyway. Swoopy Salvo, which is swarmed with these irritating woodpeckers known as swoopies, and Tyrant Twin Tussle, wherein you have to deal with Cuff and Clout, two bastards with quite possibly the most skewed and unfair collision detection in the entire series. I like Crisscross Cliffs and easily consider it the best stage in Krematoa because it's a simple yet fun challenge that provides a proper test of timing and positioning. There's this bazooka at the bottom of the stage that constantly fires barrels upwards, which you have to jump on to ascend. Occasionally there's a buzz in the way, which requires completing a short platforming sequence to change the barrels to TNT to kill it, and then switching it back to proceed, usually avoiding the stream of TNT barrels to do so. I find this level enjoyable, but unfortunately it's the exception rather than the rule. Outside of this stage, I think this world is way too obnoxious for its own good. However, what really drags it down is a baffling decision that I cannot comprehend the logic behind. For some reason, the Krematoa levels now have multiple bonus rooms in them, and you have to find every last one to collect all the bonus coins in 103% the game. And trust me, if you thought the main game's bonus rooms were obnoxious, you ain't seen nothing yet. There was a very good reason why I praised DKC2 for eschewing actual bonus rooms from the Lost World in favor of hiding the DK coin in one of them. It's because it avoids obnoxious shit like this, where in addition to merely beating these bullshit levels and making sure to find and kill the coin, you now have to keep retrying bonus rooms repeatedly, which only makes the levels drag out for even longer. Often, reaching the rooms is a pain in the ass in itself, and if you fuck them up, you'll be spat out in a place that makes it impossible to re-enter the room without dying and repeating a long section of the stage. I know I probably sound like a broken record by now, but I cannot stress enough how much I despise the fact this game makes it nearly impossible to conveniently retry bonus rooms when you fail them. Again, it destroys the pacing for me, and nowhere is that worse than in the case of Krematoa. Stampede Sprint, which is the first level in the world by the way, nice job setting the tone guys, has a rather infamous example that I alluded to earlier. You have to drag Harry, obtained at the beginning of the level, all the way to the end, where a no animal sign will spawn in the bonus barrel. If you lose this bonus challenge, you'll have to play through the entire level all over again to get another shot. The reasons this is abysmal should be pretty self-explanatory, and if I hadn't mercifully cleared the bonus room on my first try, you would never hear the end of it. My pick for the absolute worst bonus room in the game, however, is the second one in Swoopy Salvo, which is so bullshit that it's almost comedic. I fucking hate it, and it felt like I was bashing my head into a goddamn brick wall for well over half an hour. I know it may be silly to spend an extended time ranting about one specific portion of gameplay, but this one is so exceptionally bad that I have to vent anyway. Early on in the stage, you gain control of Squawks, and have to try your damnedest to avoid these stupid swoopies, which is easier said than done. I did figure out a decently consistent strat to get past them without taking damage, but it's very feel-based and practically impossible to explain. Regardless, once you get to this one green buzz blocking a hole in the tree, you have to fly upwards, somehow manage to get your way into this tree on the left with these insanely fast swoopies without taking a hit, which is nearly impossible to do in my experience, and then squeeze your way through these unkillable red buzzes that circle around the bonus room at light speed to finally get in there.
Everybody got that?
Seriously, man, I have no idea how you're supposed to do this without taking a hit, which is exactly why I said it's essential to reach this part without taking any damage, because you're most likely going to be damage boosting through the buzzes to make it in there. If you don't have an extra hit point, then just forget about it. You're not getting in. Go back to the start of the stage and try again, except don't get hit this time, jackass. If by some miracle you make it inside this bonus room, you'll quickly find out it's this really annoying green banana one where you have to weave around these stupid fucking swoopies, and if you lose, you get kicked out near the checkpoint, which of course prevents you from backtracking and trying again. As far as I can tell, you may be able to go back, but it's practically a death sentence anyway because you're likely to have only one hit point left and will have to deal with blindsides, since the camera is most certainly not designed to accommodate this. Of course, they had to make the most bullshit bonus room to enter in the game one of the fucking inconvenient ones. Great job, guys. Just excellent stuff all around. I swear to God, if you even graze these guys by so much as a single pixel, then fuck you, you lose, go back to the start of the stage and deal with all that obnoxious shit all over again, just to get one other attempt. What's so wonderful about this is that the green banana spawn points are determined by RNG, which in other cases is fine, but here, if you get a bad spot at the wrong time, you may be totally screwed. This is terrible. I have no other way to put it. What makes it especially awful is how far it is into the level. It's like halfway through or something, so every time you lose, you have to go through the first half of this hellish gauntlet all over again. However, the most insulting thing about this is how earlier in the stage, as well as later on, there's bonus rooms that are really easy to access, but also piss easy to beat. Jesus, why not swap one of these for the one that's a pain in the ass to access halfway through the stage? It's like they did this intentionally to piss you the fuck off. I'm sorry if I sound angry or agitated right now. I try not to do that in these videos anymore, but this is a case where I have no other way to express the sheer agony of what I'm describing. It is not fun to do this whatsoever, and I have no idea what the actual hell they were thinking. Thankfully, even though the level's coin is a one-try Andy, it's pretty hard to fuck up, so that's essentially a non-issue, but that doesn't save this level in particular from being the absolute trash that I feel it is. Fuck Swoopy Salvo, all my homies hate Swoopy Salvo. It is easily my pick for the worst level in DKC history. Animal Antics has got nothing on this fucking atrocious stage. If there's a silver lining to all this nonsense, at least the final level in the world, Rocket Rush, is short and has 0 bonus rooms. It doesn't even have a coin, which is good. Just let me focus on clearing the level, which is kind of annoying, honestly. I mean, what Bimbo thought it was a good idea to invert the controls here. Also, this closing segment where the rocket travels upwards is another lovely instance of poor visibility that forces memorization that I don't find particularly enjoyable. But at this point, I don't have the energy to complain anymore. I'm just sick of this shit. Oh, and the kicker? This level costs 25 bonus coins to unlock, 10 more than the rest, which is an arbitrary imposition placed in, all because of how Krematoa is accessed. So if they had designed things a little differently, the bonus rooms in the secret world could have probably been removed, meaning all the tedium you have to go through in completing them could have been prevented. Yeah, thanks guys, real nice of you. In case you can't tell by now, I'm not quite thrilled with Krematoa. I kinda hate it, to be honest, and consider it a dramatic drop-off in quality from DKC2's phenomenal Lost World. Whereas that world was well designed with only one exception, or at least I'd say it was. Krematoa is like if you applied the logical negation operator to it. With the exception of one level that I liked, I despise, or at least don't care for all of its levels. I think they're frustrating wastes of time, filled to the brim with baffling design that makes them absolutely no fun to play. At least for me. That kind of extends to the full completion playthrough of this game in general, to be honest. Say what you will about it, and if you were able to extract some enjoyment out of it, I'm happy to hear that. Don't let my bitching and complaining dissuade you from feeling that way. However, I simply cannot justify saying I enjoy getting 103% in this game with everything considered, when so much of my time hunting for bonus rooms and completing Krematoa's levels was spent being frustrated and pissed off at the design choices surrounding them. This game normally takes a few hours to complete, maybe around 3 to 4, which I'd say is a solid length. With bonus rooms though, that playtime skyrocketed to a total of 10 hours for me. Now granted, this was my first time fully completing this game, but even when I was very out of practice with DKC2's side quests for that video, it still only took around 7 hours. I could try to do it again for DKC3, and I'm sure it would take me way less time. So why did I spend so long criticizing the game for this? Well, unlike numerous other examples of games that get easier the more you play them, I didn't find going for this stuff fun in the first place, and it took so insanely long that I just wanted to forget about it and never touch this game's side content again. In my eyes, all the bonus rooms, DK coins, and banana birds really do is pad out DKC3 immensely, so whenever I return to this game, it's only going to be any percent from now on. I may have also said something similar about DKC1, but there I had an alright time finding the bonuses and wouldn't mind doing it again. In this game, I just don't think it's worth it, because all you get is a pain in the ass secret world and a whole bunch of wasted time. It really hurts me to say that, because I genuinely wanted to enjoy this game's full completion and side quests. But unfortunately, that's just not my experience. And that sucks and blows. Man, I've really been at this for a while, haven't I? Even longer than the DKC2 review, in fact, which is crazy to me. I never thought that DKC3 would be the game in this series I would end up talking about for the longest amount of time, and yet here we are. Anyway, my thoughts about this game are all over the place, which is somewhat emblematic of the game as a whole, to be honest. It's a series of ups and downs that produces nothing but contention and mixed emotions in me. And at the end of the day, it's perhaps a game I have one of the most complicated relationships with. In some ways, this continues over into the finale sequence, which I feel has many great aspects alongside a few weaker ones. For starters, I do think it's vastly inferior to DKC2's stellar closing segments, but to be fair, it probably wasn't going to clear that anyway, because that's an almost insurmountably high bar to cross. It wouldn't be impossible to surpass, but I acknowledge that, at least in this case, that probably wasn't going to happen, and I'm perfectly okay with that. For what it is, the any percent ending of this game is pretty satisfying, I must admit. Upon reaching K3 and Razor Ridge, you may observe this rather obvious extra pool of water that's currently blocked off. When you finish off Razor Ridge, a wall breaks open, revealing a spooky castle, allowing you into Chaos Core, the last main world in the game. Gee, I wonder who's hiding out in the castle. Regardless of that, I think this world is actually pretty fun, and it's where the game's level design starts to get back on track for me. Sadly, it doesn't have the same strong climactic excellence that K-Rool's Keep did, but again, I don't think it necessarily needed to, and I'd still argue it's stronger in that regard than Chimp Caverns. This world isn't half bad, and it has some pretty creative set pieces in store that don't intermittently make me want to quit playing altogether. Creepy Caverns does have that one obnoxious coin, as I mentioned earlier. Same thing for Lightning Lookout, actually. And Coin Dozer Clamber can be frustrating if you don't know what you're doing, or at least I found it to be on my first few playthroughs. But besides that, I find this world way more fun than the last few. My favorite stage in the world has to be Lightning Lookout, because, again, I think it's a really creative idea that provides a solid challenge without being stupid bullshit or poorly paced. However, even with all that said, it kind of feels like this world is missing something. Don't get me wrong, I like it, but I honestly feel it's slightly lacking in pizzazz. Yeah, I already mentioned how there's not the same climactic appeal as DKC2's last world, but that's not what I mean. This world is the last rush to save DK and Diddy, where we're really closing in on chaos now, but it still feels like we're moving at the pace of a casual Saturday afternoon stroll. I think the main thing is the lack of scenery changes, by which I mean the world still uses the same level themes we've been seeing the whole game and doesn't introduce any new ones specific to this world. In general, this makes the world feel like yet another set of stages rather than a climactic rush to castle chaos, if that makes any sense. Don't take this as me contradicting myself. I'm not asking for this game's finale section to be just like DKC2's. Again, that was probably not going to happen, but even with that said, I feel like they could have taken it a little bit further to try and make the last world more memorable, and creating at least one new level archetype would have been a great solution in my opinion. But hey, what can you do? Chaos Core is consistently fun, and honestly, after a game of so many ups and downs, that's all I can ask for. Regardless, once you reach Castle Chaos, you come face to face with the robotic son of a bitch once again. After a quick and easy fight where the Kongs swiftly take him out, something peculiar happens. It's revealed that, all along, it was actually K. Rool controlling him the entire time from behind a curtain, like he's the Wizard of Oz or something. I mean, wow. I am truly shocked. I definitely didn't see that one coming. I mean, come on, we all knew this was gonna happen, right? This whole thing where DK and Diddy disappeared in the area where there's a bunch of Kremlings, as well as a quote-unquote new leader, had K. Rool's name written all over it. It's clearly a parody of fake-out villains, and if you ask me, feels in line with the series' goofy sense of humor. Regardless, K. Rool has gone into hiding following the collapse of Crocodile Isle, and since then has adopted a new persona, Baron K. Roolenstein, a mad doctor who's an obvious reference to Dr. Frankenstein. Side note, but I find it really funny how K. Rool's roles seem like they're suffering from an off-by-one error. In the first game, he was a king on a pirate ship, whereas in the second, he's a pirate captain who uses a high-tech airship. But in this game, he's a mad scientist living in a medieval castle. If these roles were as expected, King K. Rool would be in the castle, Captain K. Rool on the ship, and Baron K. Roolenstein on the airship, but they shifted his roles one space to the right. Now, they obviously didn't plan this whole thing out from the start, but I still find that detail funny. In any case, K. Rool is pissed off at the Kongs for destroying Chaos, who he apparently built out of his wife's pots and pans. So he decided that if no one else can take them out, he's gonna do it himself. Thus, we begin the final boss fight, and I actually quite like it. Keeping with the direction of DKC3's bosses, this one has a heavier puzzle focus, asking you to pull these levers from the ceiling to get a barrel, which you can then throw at K. Rool's helipack to damage him. This fight starts out easy and gradually gets trickier with each phase, as every good final boss should. Eventually incorporating these Tesla coils you have to be careful not to touch by jumping across hooks on the ceiling, then on moving platforms, and finally by quickly running across the danger zone when it briefly turns off. As you're doing this, you also have to be careful not to run into the Baron himself, who slowly floats back and forth across the screen. All the while, you're treated to Big Boss Blues, a really tense final boss theme that I quite like, as you can observe some lightning flashes outside, presumably from the same storm that you had to avoid in Lightning Lookout. Huh, I never noticed that somehow. Strange. Anyway, great boss with a fantastic theme. If I can improve something though, I would place in a few more DK barrels, but other than that, I enjoy fighting Baron K. Roolenstein, and he caps off the game quite well. Once you land the last hit on K. Rool, he kind of awkwardly explodes. That's what it looks like. I don't know, maybe it's an emulator glitch, but I don't feel like grabbing my cartridge to verify. At any rate, once that happens, you get the game's last bonus coin, which lets you access the final Kramatoa level, but not before it's revealed that DK and Diddy were trapped inside Chaos, and were actually the ones powering him. The two Kongs, as established video game heroes, say they were impressed by Dixie and Kitty's performance, and speculate that Cranky must be as well. However, in typical Cranky fashion, he isn't. This causes a funny moment where your two playable Kongs prepare to double team him. Before he pulls the hole, you wouldn't hit a guy with glasses, would you thing? Now, imagine if they pulled the double entendre joke with that line and usurped Wreck-It Ralph by 16 entire years. Wouldn't that have been funny? I think this is a pretty charming ending, although I wouldn't say it has the same satisfaction the first two games did in this regard. It does give us one true Cranky moment in the entire game, which I appreciate greatly, and it's a solid one. However, I think something was lost by not having Cranky's genuine appreciation after such a long and arduous journey, you know? Here, he's just kind of rude to Dixie and Kitty, which, while obviously played for laughs, feels a little underwhelming to be honest. After this, we get a fun credits sequence with a pretty alright song, which is themed around a photo album, framing the typical enemy roll call as pictures the Kongs took on their adventure. After that, we're shown that rolling xylophone thing from the intro, which has a genuinely impressive sprite scaling effect, as this text deforms and disappears on the thing. Oh, and this part plays bonus time, which is always swell. Then I go and grind lives for 9 minutes again, since like DKC2, this game doesn't save your lives after you exit your save file in any way, and complete Rocket Rush, netting the final golden cog. Inserting it into the machine causes the thing to start up, which leads to the volcano awakening.
Did someone...
As a large ship known as the Nautilus rises from below the caldera. Inside the ship is Baron K. Rollenstein. Wait, what? How did he get in here? I don't know. It's never explained how he survived this borderline graphical glitch that looked like him clipping into the goddamn backrooms or some shit. But anyway, the true final fight takes place in here. To be honest, while the idea of this fight is cool, I just don't care for it because I find it obnoxious. You have to wait through these long attack cycles, and then toss a steel barrel into the air chute that opens up above, which in theory will then land on K. Rool's head. But doing this is irritating in my experience because the timing is super weird and hard to get a feel for. After the first couple times doing this, K. Rool will drop in from above, most likely right on top of you because you were trying to grab a steel keg in the center. A real cheap shot in my opinion. Then in the later parts of the fight, you have to be on the correct side of the steel barrel to avoid the electric pulses shot out by the Tesla coils on the submarine's walls, which is really annoying, especially when you miss hitting K. Rool in one of the phases before this, usually due to shoddy collision, and the barrel doesn't respawn in time. In the many more minutes than I'd like to admit I wasted on this fight, I eventually found out that pausing the game can glitch out the electric pulse, essentially acting as a despawn strat. I'm not sure if this is an emulation bug, because it may well be, but I have heard of it happening on real hardware. I can tell you for damn sure I won't be doing another full 103% playthrough on my SNES to verify this. I'm just not going to question it. Bottom line is, I don't really care much for this fight, but I can easily see how someone would really enjoy it. Maybe I just wanted the game to be over, who knows. Either way, once K. Rool is defeated, you get the final DK coin in the game, which allows you to unlock the last vehicle from Funky's Rentals. Meaning that yes, you actually are fully required to get all the DK coins to get 103%, better justifying their inclusion. Bringing them all to the Funky's workshop allows the Kong to finish his best contraption yet, the Funky Copter. Sounds cool, but in reality, all you use it for is to fly to the top left corner of the map, where you meet up with the Banana Bird Queen, a character that exists? She's literally never introduced until the last 5 minutes of the game, appearing out of thin air. She tells you to find the last few banana birds to free her from behind this wall that K. Rool cast a spell on to trap her, and it's like, what the actual hell is going on? Since when did this happen? Why leave this important plot detail out until the last few minutes of the game where the tension is supposed to be relieved, not randomly start building again out of nowhere? My fucking head hurts. So now we have to free the last few banana birds from these crystal grottos all over the place, which are by far the longest of these puzzles, so I just decided, fuck it, and wrote them all out on a sheet of paper. Upon getting all 15 banana birds, going to Wrinkly's save cave will trigger the ending cutscene, where the birds fly you to their queen, sing the song to free her from behind this 7-foot wall that somehow trapped her even though it doesn't look like it at all. And then the queen chases K. Rool in an overly long sequence and lays a huge egg on him. The end? Yeah, that's the ending you get for slogging through this game's padded side quests that, in my opinion, only serve to stretch out its playtime ad astra. It's quite disappointing if I'm honest, especially as the ending to this trilogy, which we were left with for 14 years. I feel like this would have been way more effective and impactful if they had done the logical thing and introduced the Banana Bird Queen at the start of the game somehow. Doing it this way would have provided even more motivation to take on K. Rool, and free the Mama Bird so she could teach the bastard a lesson for doing all this stuff. I think that would have been cool, and could have added a decently satisfying story arc and something to work towards. As is, it seems they just forgot about basic narrative structure, and so just randomly introduced this character out of the blue right at the end of the game. As a result, I'm not invested in the conclusion, and it just leaves me exhausted. In any event, DKC 3 finally comes to a close, and you're shown your rank on Wrinkly's TV screen. If you dare, you can even enter a cheat when starting a new game to make it even harder, removing checkpoint and DK barrels, which will result in a completion percentage of 105%. But yeah, fuck that. Not doing it. Man, what a wild ride. Why don't we wind down and finally wrap up? At the end of the day, what more is there to discuss here? I've more or less laid out my thoughts on this game in as thorough a manner as I could, hopefully in a coherent way, and yet I still feel as though I might have undersold us how torn I am on this game. Despite all my complaining and lamenting about how I find it to be very weak in many areas, I don't hate or even dislike DKC3, not even close. However, it easily gets my vote for being the weakest game in the trilogy by a country mile. It is, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the most conflicting game in the series for me. I want to love it just as much as the other two games, and be able to say it's yet another all-time platforming classic that capped off this trilogy with style and grace so badly. But I'm of the belief that honesty is the best policy, trilogy, and if I'm being honest, the game has way too many serious issues for me to say it's a worthy finale to this excellent trilogy. DKC3 tried to do a lot of stuff and was extremely ambitious, and I'd say a lot of its ideas landed quite well. But unlike the first two games, which knew their limits, I also think this game sort of crumbles under the weight of its overambition in a lot of ways as well. It has many things that I enjoy a lot, but at the same time, I also think this is the messiest, most disheveled game in the trilogy, which ultimately makes it my least favorite of the three. A lot of people love this game the most out of all three, which is totally fine. With that said though, others are even more negative than I am, and can't find anything positive to say about DKC3, which is also perfectly valid. So, is this game an underrated masterpiece that's secretly the best game in the series, or a messy, poorly conceived betrayal that totally desecrates everything that made the series so fantastic? Ultimately, it's whatever you make of it, but me personally, I'm somewhere in the middle of those two extremes. If you ask me, it almost seems like this game was rushed or something, which I unfortunately have no way of proving, but with how messy things can be, it wouldn't surprise me if it actually was. What especially leads me to believe it was, though, is the circumstances of the time. For heaven's sake, the game even acknowledges this with an Easter egg in Wrinkly's save cave, but when this was released in 1996, the SNES was on its way out, making way for the exciting new Nintendo 64 and its then revolutionary 3D graphics. Side-scrollers like this were seen as being stuck in the past, a silly perspective these days to be sure, but at the time, I can't blame people for overlooking this game in favor of stuff like Super Mario 64. In my opinion, it ultimately led to DKC3 being worse off, making it feel a lot less intelligently crafted than its predecessors. Personally, I think that's a fair comparison. Usually, comparisons are some of the weakest forms of criticism and a cop-out way of making an actual point in my opinion, but in this case, we're talking 3 games in the same series, with the same general core gameplay as each other. In my eyes, it's fair game, especially when I feel past entries were way stronger like I do in this case. Again, I don't hate this game, I just think it's a downgrade from its predecessors in almost every conceivable way, and don't find it nearly as fun to revisit as them. I feel it has less charming presentation, tired and confused theming, a less memorable soundtrack, level design that's really mixed in quality, and a miserable full completion experience with a lacking rewards that I don't ever want to play again. If you disagree with me and consider this game your favorite in the trilogy, then again, that's great. I love the fact that there's people out there who hold a different perspective than me on this game, because it makes talking about this stuff all the more interesting. I can definitely see this becoming someone's favorite in the series, even if I personally disagree. Additionally, while this game comes off as rushed and hacked together to me, I'm still glad it exists, because it provides more classic DKC action, if nothing else. And for some, that's all you really need. Again, I have to reiterate, don't take my relative disappointment with this game as a personal attack, or even as me harboring disdain towards it. I just wish it was given more time so the series would have really gone out with a bang on its console of origin, and I could have been universally singing its praises and calling this series another example of an ideal gaming trilogy, you know, where it gets better with every entry. But sadly, I can't do that. But you know what? That's alright. I feel like I've made peace with this game after all these years. Hell, this playthrough has even opened my eyes to how good some sections of it truly are, which has to be worth something. I also think I got an interesting video out of it, because it was me finally being well and truly conflicted about something for once. Whether or not you agree with me on that, well, I'll leave that up to you. In my case, that's all, and holy crap, this video was way longer than I ever could have imagined. I mean, I always say that, and I knew it would have some level of girth to it, but not this much. To be honest, while I enjoy making these massive beefers for all you lovely folks, things will probably have to change soon because I can't keep doing this forever. I mean, this year I had several multi-hour videos from me, and while I love the final products that came from all that work, I'm a little tired out from doing it so much. Going forward, I want to try and be more concise. Hey look, I said try, and make shorter stuff like I used to. My style for this type of video has developed a lot since I started doing it, which has also caused them to grow larger with each one, and honestly I think it would be in my best interest to slow that down. Hey look, you should be thanking me, since before you know it I may have ended up posting a 7-hour video. Okay, but in all seriousness, I want to have a quick heart-to-heart with you guys. The support that I've been seeing for this channel has been absolutely insane this year. I don't remember how many subscribers I started the year off with, but I've ended it off by passing the 1,000 mark, culminating in a total of well over 1,100. I don't want to sound cheesy or cliche, but I genuinely never thought I would reach this point, and I could not have done it without you guys. I started this channel off as a place for random shit posts pretty much, but now a few years out after switching to something I'm more passionate about, I've been seeing a whole bunch of new support, and I can't thank you guys enough. Thanks for such an awesome year, and I hope I've been able to provide plenty of enjoyment to you all. I think this was by far the best year of my channel, not only in terms of the obvious subscriber growth and whatnot, but the stuff I put out this year is, by my reckoning anyway, the best videos I've ever made. Unfortunately, I may not be able to make as many videos as I want to next year, because my personal life is probably going to be pretty busy, but I'll try to keep getting stuff out. I'm also looking to keep improving with each video, so I hope I'll be able to make videos that are even better than this year's. I already have a couple ideas, including going back to Sonic, but we'll see. In any event, that's all I really have to say. Thanks for watching, happy holidays, and here's to another year. Have a good one, and I'll see you around.